Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight, before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Think about that quietly. Let the question settle, and when you're ready, allow yourself to drift into the story. The fluorescent lights in the basement of the municipal building cast a pale glow across rows of metal, filing cabinets that stretched into shadows. This was where the city kept its memories, stored in manila folders and bound reports that no one had touched in years. The air carried the scent of old paper and dust, a smell that had settled into the walls themselves over decades of quiet. Accumulation. Detective Sarah Chun had discovered this place 3 months into her transfer from the busy downtown precinct. She hadn't been looking for it, had simply taken a wrong turn while searching for the building's main archive. But something about the stillness here drew her back, night after night. When the rest of the building had emptied and the only sounds were the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional creak of settling foundations. Files here were different from the active cases that crossed her desk each day. These were the closed ones, the solved ones, the ones that had been deemed complete and filed away. Each folder contained a story that had once consumed someone's days and nights, had once been urgent and pressing, but now existed only as typed reports and faded photographs, evidence bags with yellowing tags, and witness statements written in careful handwriting. She pulled a folder at random from a cabinet, marked with dates from 15 years ago. The tab read simply, Morrison, Janet, resolved. Inside, the papers were crisp despite their age, organized with the methodical care that spoke of a case that had been properly closed. The first page was a missing person report, filed on a Tuesday morning in October. The handwriting was neat, professional, the kind that belonged to someone who had filled out thousands of such forms. Janet Morrison had been reported missing by her sister when she failed to show up for their weekly lunch at a downtown cafe. The sister's statement described Janet as reliable, punctual, someone who would never simply disappear without explanation. The initial report was routine, standard procedures followed with the careful attention that marked experienced officers who understood that most missing persons cases resolved themselves within 48 hours, but this one hadn't. The next document in the file was a supplementary report, filed 3 days later. Janet's car had been found in the parking lot of a shopping center 12 miles from her apartment. The keys were still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat, but Janet herself was nowhere to be found. The reporting officer had noted that there were no signs of struggle, no indication of foul play. Just an empty car in a busy parking lot where hundreds of people came and went each day. Detective Chun settled into the wooden chair beside the filing cabinet, the folder open in her lap. The basement was perfectly quiet now, the kind of silence that seemed to amplify the sound of pages turning. She read each report slowly, letting the details wash over her like a gentle current. There was something soothing about these old cases, something peaceful in the way they had been concluded and put to rest. The investigation had continued for weeks. Janet's apartment had been searched thoroughly, revealing a life lived with careful routine. Bills paid on time, appointments kept, a calendar marked with predictable patterns of work and social obligations. Her co-workers described her as steady, dependable, someone who rarely took sick days and never left early. Friends painted a picture of a woman who planned her weekends in advance and always returned phone calls promptly. The file contained dozens of interview reports, each one adding another layer to the portrait of Janet Morrison. Neighbors who had seen nothing unusual, store clerks who recognized her as a regular customer, a dentist's receptionist who confirmed Janet had kept her appointment the day before she disappeared. Each statement was recorded with meticulous care, typed on forms that had been filed in perfect chronological order. Detective Chen found herself drawn into the rhythm of the investigation as it unfolded on paper. She could imagine the officers methodically working their way through Janet's life, checking and double-checking every detail, following every lead no matter how small. There was something almost meditative about their thoroughness, the way they had refused to overlook any possibility. 3 weeks into the investigation, a breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. A maintenance worker at the shopping center had been reviewing security footage for an unrelated incident when he noticed something odd. The cameras had captured Janet arriving at the shopping center, walking purposefully toward the main entrance, but they had also captured something else. In the corner of one frame, barely visible, was a figure following at a distance. The quality was poor, the image grainy, but it was enough to suggest that Janet hadn't been alone. The investigation had shifted then, taking on new urgency. The figure in the footage was enhanced, analyzed, compared against databases of known offenders. Tips came in from the public after the image was released to local media. Each lead was followed up, each possibility explored with the same methodical care that had characterized the investigation from the beginning. Detective Chun turned the pages slowly, letting each report register fully before moving to the next. The basement around her seemed to grow quieter with each document she read, as if the building itself was settling deeper into sleep. She could hear the faint hum of the heating system cycling on and off, a rhythmic sound that provided a gentle backdrop to her reading. The case had been solved 4 months after Janet's disappearance. A tip from someone who had recognized the figure in the security footage led police to a man with a history of following women. He had been arrested on unrelated charges and, during questioning, had confessed to following Janet that day. The confession was detailed, recorded over several hours of careful interrogation, and it painted a picture of a crime that had been both random and inevitable. Janet Morrison had been killed within hours of her disappearance, her body buried in a wooded area outside the city limits. The confession led police directly to the location, and Janet's remains were recovered on a cold morning in February, 5 months after she had left her apartment for what should have been a routine lunch with her sister. The file contained the coroner's report, typed on official letterhead with clinical precision. The cause of death was listed simply, without drama or sensationalism. Janet Morrison had died quickly, the report noted, without prolonged suffering. There was something almost comforting in the medical examiner's careful language. The way technical terms were used to describe the end of a life without dwelling on the violence that had caused it. Detective Chun closed the folder and returned it to its place in the filing cabinet. The metal drawer slid shut with a soft click that echoed briefly in the quiet basement. Janet Morrison's story was complete now, filed away with thousands of others, part of the city's vast archive of human experience. Her case had been solved, justice had been served, and her family had been given the answers they needed to find some measure of peace. She pulled another folder from a different cabinet. This one dated from nearly 20 years ago. The tab read, Henley, Robert, closed. The papers inside were older, some typed on machines that left slightly uneven letters, others handwritten in the careful script that spoke of a time when reports were still completed by hand in many departments. Robert Henley had been found dead in his home office on a Sunday morning in March. Initial responding officers had noted no signs of forced entry, no indication that anything had been disturbed. Robert was seated at his desk, slumped forward over papers that were later identified as insurance documents he had been reviewing. The scene was peaceful, almost as if he had simply fallen asleep while working. The autopsy had revealed a different story. Robert Henley had died from poisoning, a slow-acting substance that had been administered sometime in the previous 24 hours. The investigation that followed had been complex, involving interviews with dozens of people who had contact with Robert in the days before his death. Family members, business associates, neighbors, service workers, anyone who might have had opportunity to administer the poison that killed him. Detective Chun read through the investigation reports with the same quiet attention she had given to Janet Morrison's case. The officers involved had been thorough, methodical in their approach to unraveling Robert Henley's final days. Each interview was recorded in detail, each piece of evidence cataloged and analyzed. The reports painted a picture of a man who had lived a complicated life, with business dealings that sometimes put him at odds with others, family relationships that were strained by years of unresolved conflicts, the poison that killed. Robert was eventually traced to someone with access to his home, someone who had been trusted enough to prepare food or handle drinks without suspicion. The investigation had narrowed slowly, carefully, as officers eliminated possibilities and focused on those with both opportunity and motive. The resolution, when it came, was both surprising and inevitable, the kind of conclusion that made perfect sense in retrospect, but had been hidden beneath layers of deception and careful planning. The killer had been Robert's own nephew, a young man who stood to inherit a significant sum upon his uncle's death. The motive was simple, almost mundane in its ordinariness: debt, desperation, and the kind of thinking that allowed someone to rationalize murder as a solution to financial problems. The nephew had confessed during his third interview, breaking down as the evidence mounted against him, admitting to a crime that had been planned for months, but executed in a moment of panic and poor judgment. Detective Chun found herself thinking about the nephew as she read his confession, transcribed carefully by the interviewing detective. He was 24 when he killed his uncle, barely out of college, drowning in student loans and credit card debt that seemed insurmountable to someone so young. The confession revealed a person who had convinced himself that Robert's death would solve everything, that the inheritance would provide a fresh start and a chance to build a better life. But of course it hadn't worked that way. The nephew was serving a life sentence now, his inheritance long since consumed by legal fees and restitution payments. The money that had motivated the crime had disappeared into the machinery of justice, leaving behind only the archived reports that documented how greed and desperation had destroyed 2 lives instead of saving one. The basement grew quieter as the night deepened, the sounds from the street above fading to nothing. Detective Chun could hear the building settling around her, the small creaks and sighs that marked the passage of time in old structures. She found these sounds comforting, a gentle reminder that she was surrounded by the accumulated weight of years, of stories that had been told and filed away, of lives that had intersected briefly with the criminal justice system before moving on to whatever came next. She pulled a third folder, this one from a decade ago. The case involved a burglary that had escalated into something more serious, a routine break-in that had become a violent confrontation when the homeowner had returned unexpectedly. The burglar had been young, desperate, looking for items to sell for drug money. The homeowner had been elderly, frail, unable to defend himself against someone 40 years younger, and driven by addiction and desperation. The reports documented how the case had unfolded, how responding officers had found the elderly man injured but alive, how the investigation had quickly identified the burglar through fingerprints left on a window frame. The arrest had come within days, the trial had been swift, and the sentence had been appropriate to the crime. But the real story was in the details, in the careful documentation of how 2 lives had intersected in a moment of violence that neither had planned or wanted. Detective Chen read about the elderly man's recovery, how he had spent weeks in the hospital, how he had eventually returned home, but never felt completely safe again. She read about the burglar's withdrawal from drugs in jail, how he had slowly emerged from the fog of addiction to confront what he had done to another human being. The file contained letters the young man had written to his victim, apologies that were both heartfelt and inadequate, attempts to make amends for something that could never be undone. The case had been resolved in the courtroom, but its effects had rippled outward through families and communities, touching lives that were never directly involved in the crime itself. The elderly man's children had moved him to an assisted living facility, unable to trust that he would be safe living alone. The burglar's mother had written to the judge, a letter that was included in the file, describing her son's childhood, his struggles with addiction, her own feelings of failure and responsibility for what he had become. Detective Chun found herself moved by the mother's letter, by the careful way she had tried to explain without excusing, to provide context without minimizing the harm her son had caused. The letter was handwritten on simple stationery, the kind that suggested someone who rarely wrote formal correspondence, but who had felt compelled to try to reach across the courtroom divide between victim and perpetrator, between punishment and understanding. She closed this folder as well, returning it to its place among hundreds of others. Each file contained a complete story, a beginning and middle and end, carefully documented and preserved. These were the cases that had been solved, the crimes that had been answered with arrests and trials and sentences. They represented the successful functioning of a system designed to impose order on chaos, to find meaning in violence, to transform victimization into justice. But Detective Chun was drawn to these files for reasons that had nothing to do with their successful resolution. She found comfort in their completeness, in the way they demonstrated that even the most troubling human experiences could be contained within manila folders, reduced to typed reports and filed photographs. There was something peaceful about the finality of closed cases, something that satisfied a deep need for order and conclusion. The basement held thousands of such files, stretching back decades, representing countless hours of investigation and documentation. Each folder was a testament to the work of officers and detectives who had dedicated their careers to making sense of senseless acts, to finding truth in the aftermath of deception and violence. The files were their legacy, careful records of their efforts to serve justice and protect the innocent. As the night wore on, Detective Chun continued her quiet exploration of the archives. She pulled files at random, reading through investigations that spanned months or years, following the careful accumulation of evidence that had eventually led to arrests and convictions. Some cases were simple, straightforward crimes with obvious perpetrators and clear motives. Others were complex puzzles that had required years to solve, involving multiple jurisdictions and sophisticated forensic techniques. She read about domestic violence cases that had escalated to murder, about financial crimes that had destroyed families and businesses, about drug deals that had gone wrong and left bodies in their wake. Each case was different in its details but similar in its fundamental structure. A crime had been committed, an investigation had been conducted, evidence had been gathered, and justice had been served. The files documented this process with meticulous care, preserving not just the facts of each case, but the methodology that had led to their resolution. The comfort Detective Chun found in these archives came from their demonstration that chaos could be contained, that violence could be answered with law, that even the most disturbing human behaviors could be understood and addressed through careful investigation and thoughtful application of justice. The files represented order imposed on disorder, meaning extracted from meaninglessness, hope maintained in the face of humanity's darkest impulses. She pulled a file from the 1990s, a case involving the murder of a convenience store clerk during a robbery. The investigation had been complicated by the lack of witnesses and the absence of security cameras, common problems in that era before digital surveillance became ubiquitous. The detectives had worked for months, interviewing hundreds of people, following up on tips and leads that mostly led nowhere. The breakthrough had come from forensic evidence, a fingerprint lifted from a candy wrapper that had been left at the scene. The print had matched someone in the database, a young man with a record of petty crimes who lived in the neighborhood where the store was located. The arrest had led to a confession, and the confession had revealed a crime motivated by desperation and poor judgment rather than inherent evil. Detective Chun read the killer's statement, recorded during hours of careful questioning. He had been 19 at the time, unemployed, facing eviction from his apartment. The robbery had been impulsive, unplanned, motivated by immediate need rather than criminal intent. He had never meant to hurt anyone, had panicked when the clerk had tried to resist, had fired a gun he barely knew how to use in a moment of fear and confusion. The clerk had been 22, working nights to pay for college, planning to become a teacher. The file contained statements from his family, descriptions of a young man who had been kind and ambitious, who had volunteered with children and dreamed of making a positive difference in the world. His death had devastated a large extended family, had eliminated possibilities that would never be realized, had created grief that would last for generations. The killer was serving a life sentence without possibility of parole, punishment that fit the magnitude of his crime, but could never restore what had been lost. The clerk's family had attended the trial, had given victim impact statements that were included in the file, had watched justice being served while knowing it could never bring back their son, their brother, their nephew who had died for the contents of a cash register that held less than $200. Detective Chun found herself thinking about the randomness of such crimes, the way lives could intersect in moments of violence that changed everything for everyone involved. The clerk and his killer had probably never met before that night, had no shared history or mutual grievances. Their lives had collided purely by chance, in a convenience store that might have been robbed by someone else on a different night, or might never have been robbed at all if circumstances had been slightly different. Yet the crime had happened, and its consequences had rippled outward through communities and families, creating victims beyond just the immediate participants. The clerk's family had suffered not just the loss of a loved one, but the knowledge that his death had been meaningless, motivated by nothing more significant than a young man's immediate need for money. The killer's family had suffered too, watching someone they loved transformed from a troubled but redeemable young person into a convicted murderer serving a life sentence. The file documented all of this, with careful attention to detail, preserving not just the facts of the crime, but its broader context and consequences. Police reports, witness statements, forensic analysis, court transcripts, sentencing documents, each piece of paper added another layer to a complete picture of how violence had erupted and been answered, how chaos had been contained and addressed through the careful application of law and procedure. As Detective Chun continued reading, she found herself drawn deeper into the quiet rhythm of the archives. The basement around her seemed to exist outside of time, a place where past and present merged in the careful preservation of human stories. Each file was a complete narrative with beginning and middle and end, carefully documented and preserved for posterity. The archives represented something profound about human nature and society. She realized they demonstrated humanity's fundamental need to make sense of senseless acts, to find meaning in violence, to impose order on chaos through careful documentation and methodical investigation. Every file was a testament to the belief that truth could be found, that justice could be served, that even the most disturbing crimes could be understood and addressed. Through patience and careful work, she pulled another file, this one involving a hit-and-run accident that had killed a young mother walking her baby in a stroller. The investigation had taken months, involving analysis of paint chips and glass fragments, interviews with dozens of potential witnesses, and careful reconstruction of the accident scene. The driver had eventually been identified through forensic evidence and arrested, convicted of vehicular manslaughter and sentenced to several years in prison. But the real story was in the details that surrounded the crime. The young mother had been crossing a street she had crossed hundreds of times before, pushing a stroller containing her 6-month-old daughter, who had somehow survived the impact uninjured. The driver had been drinking, not heavily but enough to slow his reaction time and cloud his judgment. He had left the scene not from criminal intent, but from panic and poor decision-making. Had spent weeks afterward knowing he had killed someone but afraid to come forward. The investigation had been led by a detective nearing retirement, someone who had worked hundreds of similar cases over a 30-year career. The reports showed his methodical approach to evidence gathering, His patient interviewing technique, his refusal to overlook any detail that might lead to the identification of the responsible driver. The case had consumed months of his time, but he had never wavered in his commitment to finding justice for the young mother and her surviving family. The killer had eventually confessed during his arrest, breaking down as he described the accident and his failure to stop and render aid. The confession revealed someone tortured by guilt and remorse, someone who had relived the accident every day since it happened, who had wanted to come forward but lacked the courage to face the consequences of his actions. His statement was both an admission of guilt and a plea for understanding, an attempt to explain the inexplicable decision to leave the scene of an accident that had claimed an innocent life. Detective Chun read through the victim impact statements given at sentencing. Descriptions of a young woman who had been beloved by family and friends, who had been a devoted mother and loving daughter, who had been planning to return to college to finish her degree once her daughter was old enough for daycare. Her death had created a void that could never be filled, had left a baby without a mother and parents without a child, had eliminated possibilities and dreams that would never be realized. The killer had served his sentence and been released, had attempted to rebuild his life while carrying the permanent burden of knowing he had taken another life through his carelessness and poor judgment. The file contained letters he had written to the victim's family, apologies that were both heartfelt and inadequate, attempts to make amends for something that could never be undone. The family had never responded to his letters, a silence that spoke volumes about the permanent nature of his crime and its consequences. The baby had survived and been raised by her grandparents, growing up in the shadow of a tragedy that had shaped her entire family. The file contained updates on her progress, reports from social services that documented how she was thriving despite the traumatic loss of her mother. She was now a teenager, according to the most recent documents, doing well in school and apparently unaware of the specific circumstances that had led to her mother's death. Detective Chen found herself wondering about this young woman, now old enough to understand what had happened that day when she was 6 months old. Did she know the details of her mother's death? Did she remember anything from that day? Or were her only memories the stories told by family members who had raised her? The file didn't answer these questions, focusing instead on the criminal justice aspects of the case. But they lingered in Detective Chun's mind as she closed the folder and returned it to its place. The basement grew quieter as the night deepened, the sounds from outside fading to nothing. Detective Chun could hear only the gentle hum of ventilation systems and the occasional creak of settling foundations, sounds that provided a peaceful backdrop to her exploration of the archives. She found these late-night sessions restorative, a way to reconnect with the fundamental purpose of police work while surrounded by evidence of justice. Successfully served. She pulled a file from the early 2000s, a case involving credit card fraud that had escalated when the perpetrator had been confronted by one of his victims. The fraud itself had been relatively minor, involving stolen credit card numbers used to make small purchases that wouldn't immediately trigger security alerts. But the confrontation had turned violent when the victim had recognized the fraudster, using his card at a local store, and had attempted to detain him until police arrived. The resulting fight had left the victim with serious injuries and the fraudster facing assault charges in addition to the financial crimes. The investigation had been straightforward, with multiple witnesses and clear evidence of both the fraud and the assault. But the case revealed the complex ways that seemingly minor crimes could escalate into major violence. How desperate people could make decisions that transformed them from petty criminals into violent offenders. The fraudster had been a college student, drowning in debt and unable to find legitimate work that paid enough to cover his expenses. The credit card fraud had started small, just enough to buy food and pay for basic necessities, but had gradually expanded as his financial situation worsened. He had told himself that he was borrowing rather than stealing, that he would somehow find a way to pay back what he had taken, that the credit card companies could absorb the losses without real harm to anyone. The victim had been a middle-aged man who had noticed unusual charges on his credit card statement and had become suspicious when he saw someone using a card with his name on it. His decision to confront the fraudster had been impulsive, motivated by anger and a desire to see justice done immediately rather than waiting for police to investigate. The confrontation had escalated quickly, with both men making decisions that transformed a financial crime into a violent assault. Detective Chun read through the statements given by witnesses, descriptions of the fight that had erupted in the store parking lot. The fraudster had panicked when confronted, had lashed out physically rather than trying to run or de-escalate the situation. The victim had been determined to prevent the fraudster from escaping, had continued fighting even after being injured, driven by rage and a sense of violated justice that overcame his concern for his own safety. The case had been resolved with plea bargains that acknowledged the complex circumstances surrounding both crimes. The fraudster had pled guilty to fraud and assault, receiving a sentence that combined prison time with restitution payments and community service. The victim had recovered from his injuries but had been forced to confront the reality that his decision to take justice into his own hands had nearly cost him his life and had certainly made a bad situation worse. The file contained correspondence between the two men, letters exchanged during the fraudster's imprisonment. The victim had written first, not to forgive, but to try to understand how someone his son's age could have made such destructive decisions. The fraudster had responded with detailed explanations of his financial struggles and poor judgment, accepting responsibility for his crimes while trying to provide context that might help the victim make sense of what had happened. Their correspondence had continued for months, gradually evolving from angry accusations and defensive explanations into something approaching mutual understanding. Neither man excused what the other had done, but both came to recognize the human complexity that had led to their violent encounter. The victim had eventually supported the fraudster's early release, believing that continued imprisonment would serve no useful purpose once genuine remorse and responsibility had been demonstrated. Detective Chun found their correspondence moving, evidence of the possibility for redemption and forgiveness even in the aftermath of serious crime. The letters showed two people working to make sense of a senseless situation, trying to find meaning and purpose in an encounter that had damaged both their lives. Their ability to move beyond anger and blame towards something approaching understanding seemed almost miraculous, a testament to human resilience and the possibility for growth even in the darkest circumstances. The fraudster had been released after serving 3 years, had completed his education and found legitimate work, had continued making restitution payments until his debt was fully satisfied. The victim had recovered from his injuries and had become an advocate for restorative justice, programs that brought criminals and victims together in covering programs, controlled settings designed to promote understanding and healing. Both men had transformed a traumatic experience into an opportunity for personal growth and positive contribution to their communities. Their story was unusual in unhotic experience into an opportunity for personal growth and positive contribution to their communities. Their story was unusual in the opportunity for Kirkinti for personal growth and Todavant for personal growth and to positive contribution to their communities. Detective Chun's experience, representing a best-case scenario for how crime and punishment could lead to genuine rehabilitation and forgiveness. Most cases in the archives didn't end with such positive outcomes, didn't demonstrate such clear evidence of redemption and mutual understanding. But their correspondence reminded her that even the most troubling human behaviors were committed by complex individuals capable of change and growth, that the criminal justice system at its best could facilitate transformation rather than simply imposing punishment. She closed the file and pulled another, this one from just 5 years ago. The case involved a series of residential burglaries that had terrorized a middle-class neighborhood for months before the perpetrator was finally identified and arrested. The crimes themselves had been relatively minor in terms of financial loss, involving mostly electronic equipment and jewelry that could be easily sold. But their psychological impact had been enormous, creating fear and suspicion that had divided a previously close-knit community. The investigation had been led by a Detective Chun, recognized from her current precinct, someone she had worked with on recent cases. Reading his reports gave her insight into his methodical approach to evidence gathering and his patient interviewing technique. The burglar had been careful and systematic, studying his targets carefully and striking only when houses were empty and neighbors were unlikely to observe. His caution had made him difficult to catch, but had also limited the scope of his crimes, preventing the kind of escalation that might have led to violence if he had encountered homeowners during his break-ins. The resolution had come through community cooperation rather than sophisticated police work. Neighbors had organized watch groups and communication networks that eventually identified suspicious activity in their area. The burglar had been caught in the act by residents who had been waiting and watching, who had called police and maintained surveillance until officers arrived. His arrest had ended the crime spree, but had also revealed the complex social dynamics that had developed in the neighborhood during months of fear and suspicion. Burglar had been a young man struggling with drug addiction, someone who had grown up in the same neighborhood he had been victimizing. Many of his victims had known him as a child, had watched him grow up, and had been shocked to learn that someone from their own community was responsible for the crimes that had made them feel unsafe in their own homes. His familiarity with the neighborhood had enabled his crimes, but had also ensured his eventual capture. Once residents began paying closer attention to unusual activity in their area, Detective Chun read through the victim impact statements from his sentencing hearing. Descriptions of how the burglaries had affected not just the immediate victims, but the entire community. Residents described installing security systems and changing their daily routines, avoiding activities they had previously enjoyed because they no longer felt safe leaving their homes unattended. Children had been kept inside after school instead of playing in yards and parks. Elderly residents had become isolated and fearful, and the general atmosphere of trust and openness that had characterized the neighborhood had been replaced by suspicion and anxiety. The burglar's statement to the court had acknowledged the broader impact of his crimes, recognizing that he had stolen more than just property from his victims. He had taken their sense of security and community, had transformed a place where people had felt safe and welcome into somewhere they feared and mistrusted. His addiction had driven him to commit crimes against people who had known and cared about him as a child, who had watched him struggle with drugs and wished they could have done something to help him. Before he turned to crime, his sentence had included not just prison time but also community service that required him to work on neighborhood improvement projects after his release. The court had recognized that his crimes had been committed against the community as a whole, and that his rehabilitation should include efforts to repair the damage he had caused to community cohesion and trust. The approach represented a more sophisticated understanding of crime and punishment than simple incarceration, acknowledging that some crimes required healing that went beyond individual accountability. The file contained updates on the neighborhoods, recovery from the crime spree, reports on community meetings and initiatives designed to rebuild trust and cooperation. Residents had continued their watch groups and communication networks even after the burglar's arrest, transforming temporary security measures into permanent improvements in community organization and mutual support. The crime spree had ultimately strengthened neighborhood bonds rather than destroying them, creating lasting improvements in how residents looked out for each other and worked together to address common concerns. Detective Chun found this outcome encouraging, evidence that communities could emerge stronger from traumatic experiences when they responded with cooperation rather than isolation. The burglar's crimes had certainly caused real harm, had created fear and anxiety that had lasted long after his arrest. But the neighborhood's response had demonstrated the resilience of human communities and their ability to transform negative experiences into opportunities for positive change and growth. As she continued her exploration of the archives, Detective Chun began to see patterns in the cases she read. Crimes that seemed random and senseless often revealed underlying patterns of desperation, addiction, mental illness, or social dysfunction that helped explain, if not excuse, the criminal behavior. Victims who initially sought only punishment often found that understanding the circumstances behind their victimization helped them process their trauma and move toward healing. Communities that initially responded to crime with fear and isolation often discovered that cooperation and mutual support were more effective than individual security measures. The files documented not just crimes and their investigation, but the broader social processes through which communities responded to and recovered from criminal victimization. They showed how the criminal justice system functioned not just to punish wrongdoing, but to facilitate understanding, healing, and positive change in the aftermath of traumatic experiences. Each closed case represented not just the successful resolution of a criminal investigation, but the restoration of social order and community trust that crime had disrupted. She pulled a file from the 1980s, a case involving domestic violence that had escalated to attempted murder when a woman had finally left her abusive husband. The investigation had been complicated by the victim's initial reluctance to cooperate with prosecutors, a common problem in domestic violence cases where victims often feared retaliation more than they trusted the justice system's ability to protect them. The case had required months of patient work by victim advocates and prosecutors, who had gradually earned the woman's trust and helped her find the courage to testify against her abuser. The abuse had been ongoing for years, escalating gradually from verbal threats to physical violence to the attempted murder that had finally brought police intervention. The woman had endured broken bones, concussions, and psychological trauma that had left her isolated from family and friends who might have provided support and assistance. Her husband had systematically destroyed her connections to the outside world, controlling her access to money, transportation, and communication in ways that made escape seem impossible. The attempted murder had occurred when the woman had finally managed to leave, taking their children and moving to a domestic violence shelter in another city. Her husband had tracked her down despite the shelter's security measures, had confronted her in the parking lot of her new workplace, and had shot her 3 times before being subdued by witnesses who had called police and provided first aid until paramedics arrived. She had survived but had required months of medical treatment and rehabilitation to recover from her injuries. Detective Chun read through the medical reports documenting the woman's injuries, clinical descriptions of trauma that spoke to years of systematic abuse rather than just the immediate effects of the shooting. Old fractures that had healed improperly, scars from cigarette burns and knife wounds, evidence of head trauma that suggested repeated concussions over an extended period. The shooting had been just the culmination of a pattern of violence that had been building for years. The final escalation in a relationship characterized by control and intimidation. The investigation had revealed the complex ways that domestic violence operated, how abusers use psychological manipulation as well as physical force to maintain control over their victims. The woman's husband had convinced her that she was worthless and incompetent, that no one would believe her if she reported the abuse, that he would kill her and their children if she ever tried to leave. He had isolated her from family and friends who might have provided support, had controlled every aspect of her daily life. had made her financially and emotionally dependent on someone who was systematically destroying her. The case had been prosecuted as attempted murder rather than domestic violence. Acknowledging the severity of the crime and the ongoing threat the abuser posed to his victim's safety, the trial had required extensive testimony about the pattern of abuse that had preceded the shooting. Evidence that helped jurors understand why the woman had stayed in the relationship for so long, and why the shooting represented such a clear escalation in violence. The prosecution had worked closely with victim advocates, who had helped prepare the woman to testify, and had provided ongoing support. Throughout the legal process, the abuser had been convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison, punishment that reflected both the severity of his crime and the ongoing threat he posed to his victim's safety. The sentence had provided the woman with time to rebuild her life while knowing that her abuser could not retaliate against her for cooperating with prosecutors. She had used that time to complete her education, find stable employment, and provide a safe and secure home for her children who had also been traumatized by years of witnessing domestic violence. The file contained updates on the family's progress over the years following the conviction. The woman had become an advocate for other domestic violence survivors, using her experience to help other women recognize the warning signs of abuse and find the resources they needed to escape dangerous relationships. Her children had received counseling and support services that had helped them process the trauma of witnessing years of violence, and they had grown into healthy adults who understood the difference between love and control. Detective Chun found herself moved by the woman's transformation from victim to survivor to advocate. The way she had used her traumatic experience to help others in similar situations. The case demonstrated the possibility for healing and growth, even after the most severe trauma. The capacity of human beings to find meaning and purpose in their suffering by using it to help others. The woman's advocacy work had probably prevented other women from enduring similar abuse, had probably saved lives through her willingness to share her story and provide support to those who needed it. She closed the domestic violence file and pulled another from a different decade. This one involving financial fraud that had targeted elderly residents in assisted living facilities. The perpetrator had been an employee at multiple facilities, someone with access to residents' personal information and financial documents. She had used her position of trust to gradually drain the savings accounts of residents who were too confused or isolated to notice the theft until their money was gone. The investigation had been complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and coordination with federal agencies that handled financial crimes crossing state lines. The fraud had continued for years before being detected, with the perpetrator moving from facility to facility when suspicion began to focus on her activities. She had been careful to target residents who had no family members checking on their finances, who were unlikely to notice small withdrawals that gradually escalated to major theft over time. The case had been broken when a new administrator at one of the facilities had noticed irregularities in residents' accounts during a routine audit. The investigation that followed had revealed a pattern of theft that had victimized dozens of elderly people, many of whom had lost their life savings to someone they had trusted as a caregiver. The financial impact had been devastating for victims who were too old to rebuild their savings and who had been forced to rely on public assistance for their basic needs. Detective Chun read through the victim impact statements from the sentencing hearing. Descriptions of elderly people who had worked their entire lives to save money for a secure retirement, only to have it stolen by someone they had trusted. Many of the victims had been too embarrassed or confused to report the theft immediately, had blamed themselves for being careless with their money, rather than recognizing that they had been deliberately victimized by someone in a position of authority and trust. The perpetrator had been sentenced to federal prison and ordered to pay restitution, but most of the stolen money was never recovered. She had spent it on luxury items and gambling, had lived well while her victims struggled with poverty and insecurity in their final years. Her sentence provided some measure of justice, but could never restore what had been taken from people who had no opportunity to earn it back. Case had led to changes in how assisted living facilities monitored their employees, access to residents' financial information, new safeguards designed to prevent similar crimes in the future. Background checks had been enhanced, audit procedures had been improved, and family members had been given greater access to information about their relatives' financial status. The reforms represented a positive outcome from a tragic situation, evidence that the criminal justice system could learn from individual cases and implement changes that protected potential future victims. As Detective Chun continued reading, she noticed that many of the cases in the archives had led to similar systemic improvements. Crimes that revealed weaknesses in security procedures, gaps in background check systems, or inadequacies in victim support services often resulted in policy changes that reduced the likelihood of similar crimes in the future. The files documented not just individual cases, but the evolution of criminal justice practices over time. The gradual accumulation of knowledge and experience that had improved the system's ability to prevent crime and support victims. She pulled a file from the mid-1990s, a case involving a serial arsonist who had set fires in abandoned buildings throughout the city over a period of several months. The fires had started small, involving vacant lots and isolated structures that posed little immediate danger to occupied buildings. But they had gradually escalated in size and risk, eventually threatening residential areas and requiring major emergency responses that strained the city's firefighting resources. Investigation had been led jointly by police and fire department. Investigators who had worked to identify patterns in the byruns, fire's timing, location, and method of ignition. The arsonist had been methodical in his approach, using similar techniques and materials for each fire, striking at times when the risk of detection was minimal. But his need for increasingly dramatic fires had eventually led him to take risks that enabled investigators to identify and arrest him. The arsonist had been a young man with a history of mental illness and substance abuse, someone who had been struggling with depression and social isolation that had made fire setting seem like an outlet for frustration and powerlessness. His fires had given him a sense of control and importance that he couldn't find in other areas of his life, had provided excitement and purpose that had temporarily relieved his feelings of worthlessness and despair. Chun read through the psychiatric evaluations that had been conducted during the legal process, clinical assessments that had revealed the complex psychological factors behind the fire-setting behavior. The arsonist had not intended to harm anyone, had carefully chosen targets that he believed were safely isolated from occupied buildings. But his judgment had been impaired by mental illness and substance abuse, and several of his fires had come dangerously close to spreading to residential areas where people could have been killed. The case had been resolved through a combination of criminal prosecution and mental health treatment, acknowledging both the public safety threat posed by the arsonist's behavior and the underlying psychological issues that had motivated his crimes. He had been sentenced to prison time, followed by mandatory psychiatric treatment and supervision, an approach designed to address both punishment and rehabilitation in recognition of his mental health needs. The file contained reports on the arsonist's progress in treatment, documentation of his gradual understanding of the danger he had posed to the community, and his development of healthier coping mechanisms for dealing with depression and social isolation. He had eventually been released under supervision and had become an advocate for mental health services, using his experience to help other young people recognize the warning signs of psychological distress before it led to criminal behavior. His transformation had been remarkable, Detective Chun thought, evidence of the possibility for genuine rehabilitation when criminal behavior stemmed from treatable mental health issues rather than fundamental character defects. The case had required a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between mental illness and criminal behavior, an approach that balanced public safety concerns with recognition of the arsonist's potential for positive change. She closed the arson file and pulled another, this one involving a drunk driving accident that had killed a family of 4 returning from a vacation. The investigation had been straightforward, with clear evidence of the driver's intoxication and multiple witnesses to the collision. But the case had been complicated by the drunk driver's own serious injuries, which had required months of medical treatment before he was physically able to stand trial for vehicular homicide. The accident had occurred on a weekend evening when the drunk driver had left a bar and attempted to drive home despite being severely intoxicated. He had crossed the center line of a 2-lane highway and collided head-on with a minivan, carrying 2 parents and their 2 young children who were returning from a week at the beach. All 4 members of the family had been killed instantly, while the drunk driver had survived with injuries that had required multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation. Detective Chun read through the investigation reports documenting the evidence of the driver's intoxication, blood tests that showed alcohol levels nearly 3 times the legal limit. The bar where he had been drinking had continued serving him, despite obvious signs of intoxication, and surveillance footage showed him stumbling to his car and having difficulty starting the engine before driving away. Multiple witnesses had seen his erratic driving in the minutes before the collision, weaving across lanes and driving at speeds inappropriate for the winding mountain road. The family he had killed had been beloved members of their community, active in their church and their children's schools, known for their kindness and generosity toward others. The father had been a teacher, the mother had worked for a nonprofit organization, and their children had been bright and energetic kids who had been looking forward to starting a new school year. Their deaths had devastated extended families and shocked a community that had known them as people who made positive contributions to everyone around them. The drunk driver had no memory of the accident itself, had awakened in the hospital to learn that his decision to drive while intoxicated had killed 4 innocent people. His own injuries had been severe enough to require months of painful rehabilitation, during which he had been forced to confront the reality of what his actions had caused. The physical pain of his recovery had been compounded by psychological trauma and guilt that had required extensive counseling and support. The case had been prosecuted as vehicular homicide, with the drunk driver ultimately pleading guilty and receiving a sentence of 25 years in prison. The trial had been attended by members of the victims' extended families, who had given powerful testimony about the impact of their loss on everyone who had known and loved the family. Their statements had described not just the immediate grief of losing loved ones, but the ongoing consequences of deaths that had eliminated possibilities and relationships that could never be replaced. The drunk driver had also given a statement at sentencing, accepting full responsibility for his actions and expressing remorse that seemed genuine despite its inadequacy in the face of such devastating loss. He had described his own struggle with alcoholism and his failure to seek help before his drinking led to tragedy, had acknowledged that his victims had paid the ultimate price for his poor judgment and lack of self-control. Detective Chun found the victim impact statements particularly moving, descriptions of how the family's deaths had affected not just immediate relatives but teachers, students, co-workers, and community members who had known them. The ripple effects of their loss extended through multiple communities and institutions, touching hundreds of people who had been enriched by their presence and who now faced an emptiness that could never be filled. The case had also led to changes in how bars monitored their customers, alcohol consumption, and in how communities educated people about the dangers of drunk driving. The tragedy had been used as an example in educational programs designed to prevent similar accidents, and the victims' families had become advocates for stronger drunk driving laws and better treatment programs for people struggling with alcoholism. As the night deepened, Detective Chun found herself drawn into a meditative rhythm of reading and reflection. Each file told a complete story of human failure and institutional response, of lives disrupted by crime and communities working to restore order and justice. The cases varied enormously in their details, but shared common themes of cause and consequence, of actions leading to reactions, of the complex ways that individual choices created broader social impacts. She pulled a file from the early 2000s, a case involving identity theft that had ruined the credit and reputation of dozens of victims before the perpetrator was identified and arrested. The thief had been sophisticated in her methods, using stolen personal information to open credit accounts and take out loans that she never intended to repay. She had targeted people whose identities were unlikely to be monitored closely: elderly, individuals, and people with limited English skills who might not immediately notice unauthorized activity on their credit reports. The investigation had required cooperation between local police and federal agencies with expertise in financial crimes, as well as coordination with credit reporting companies and financial institutions that had been victimized along with individual consumers. The identity thief had been careful to limit her activities in any single jurisdiction, spreading her crimes across multiple states to avoid detection and make investigation more difficult. The case had been broken when one of her victims had noticed suspicious activity and had reported it to authorities who were already investigating similar crimes in other jurisdictions. The investigation that followed had revealed an elaborate scheme involving false identities, mail forwarding services, and sophisticated knowledge of credit reporting systems. The thief had made hundreds of thousands of dollars from her crimes, while destroying the financial lives of people who had done nothing wrong except have their personal information stolen. Detective Chun read through the statements given by victims, descriptions of people who had discovered that their credit ratings had been destroyed by someone else's criminal activity. Many had lost job opportunities, been denied housing, and been forced to spend years working to restore their financial reputations. The process of proving their innocence and correcting their credit reports had been time-consuming and expensive, requiring legal assistance that many could barely afford. The identity thief had been prosecuted under federal laws that carried significant penalties for financial crimes, but the restitution she was ordered to pay would never fully compensate her victims for the time, money, and emotional distress caused by her actions. Many victims had spent thousands of dollars on legal fees and credit monitoring services, had lost opportunities that could never be recovered, and had suffered stress and anxiety that had affected their health and family relationships. The case had led to improvements in how credit reporting companies verified identity and monitored for suspicious activity. New safeguards designed to make identity theft more difficult and to help victims recover more quickly when their information was stolen. The reforms had been a positive outcome from a destructive crime, evidence that the system could learn and adapt to new forms of criminal activity. She pulled another file, this one involving a child custody dispute that had escalated to kidnapping. When a divorced father had taken his children and fled the state, rather than comply with a court order granting custody to his ex-wife. The investigation had involved multiple jurisdictions and had required careful coordination to ensure the children's safety while locating and arresting their father. The custody dispute had been bitter and prolonged, involving allegations of abuse and neglect that had been investigated by Child Protective Services and had ultimately resulted in supervised visitation for the father. He had been unable to accept the court's decision and had convinced himself that taking the children was necessary to protect them from their mother, despite evidence that his allegations were unfounded and motivated by his own inability to accept the end of his marriage. The kidnapping had traumatized the children, who had been told by their father that their mother no longer wanted them and that they could never return home. They had been moved frequently to avoid detection, had been enrolled in schools under false names, and had been isolated from extended family members who might have helped authorities locate them. The father's actions had been motivated by his belief that he was protecting his children, but the result had been to traumatize them and deprive them of stability and security. Detective Chun read through the investigation reports, documenting the careful work required to locate the missing children without endangering them. Law enforcement agencies in multiple states had coordinated their efforts, sharing information and resources while maintaining surveillance that would enable them to act quickly when the father and children were located. The investigation had required months of patient work, following leads and tracking financial records that eventually led to their discovery. The children had been found living in a small apartment under assumed names, isolated from other children and dependent entirely on their father for information about the outside world. Their rescue had been carefully planned to minimize trauma, with child welfare specialists involved to help them understand what was happening and to begin the process of reuniting them with their mother. Their father had been arrested without violence, cooperating with officers once he realized that resistance would only frighten his children further. The reunification process had been gradual and careful, recognizing that the children had been taught to fear their mother and had been traumatized by months of instability and deception. They had required extensive counseling to help them process their experience and rebuild their relationship with their mother, who had never stopped searching for them and had maintained hope for their safe return. Throughout the ordeal, the father had been prosecuted for kidnapping and had received a significant prison sentence that reflected both the seriousness of his crime and the trauma he had caused his children. The case had also resulted in changes to how custody disputes were monitored, new procedures designed to identify parents at risk of violating custody orders and to intervene before children could be endangered by parental desperation and poor judgment. As Detective Chun continued her exploration of the archives, she began to see how each case contributed to a larger understanding of crime and justice, how individual investigations built upon each other to create a body of knowledge that improved law enforcement's ability to prevent crime and support victims. The files documented not just successful prosecutions, but the evolution of investigative techniques, victim support services, and crime prevention strategies that had been developed through decades of experience with similar cases. She pulled a file from the late 1980s, a case involving a series of armed robberies that had terrorized small businesses throughout the city over a period of several months. The robber had been methodical in his approach, studying his targets carefully and striking at times when businesses were likely to have cash on hand but minimal security or police presence. His crimes had escalated in boldness and violence, creating fear among business owners and customers who no longer felt safe in areas that had previously been considered secure. The investigation had been led by a robbery detective who had spent months analyzing patterns in the crimes, looking for connections that might lead to the robber's identification. The perpetrator had been careful to vary his methods and timing, but he had also developed preferences and habits that eventually enabled investigators to predict where he might strike next. The case had been solved through a combination of surveillance, witness interviews, and forensic evidence that had gradually narrowed the pool of suspects. The robber had been a young man with a history of drug addiction and petty crime, someone who had escalated to armed robbery as his need for money to support his habit had increased. His crimes had been motivated by desperation rather than greed, but they had created genuine terror among his victims and had threatened the economic stability of small businesses that were already struggling to survive in difficult economic times. Detective Chun read through the statements given by the robber's victims, descriptions of business owners and employees who had feared for their lives during the robberies and who had continued to suffer anxiety and hypervigilance long after the crimes had ended. Many had installed expensive security systems, had changed their business practices to minimize cash on hand, and had considered closing their businesses rather than continuing to operate in fear of future robberies. The psychological impact of the robberies had extended beyond immediate victims to include customers and community members who had avoided the affected businesses and had altered their own routines to minimize risk. The robbers' actions had created a climate of fear that had affected entire neighborhoods, damaging economic activity and community cohesion in ways that lasted long. After his arrest and conviction, the robber had been sentenced to 20 years in prison after pleading guilty to multiple counts of armed robbery. His statement to the court had acknowledged the harm he had caused to his victims and their communities, had expressed remorse for crimes that he recognized had been motivated by his addiction, but that had terrorized innocent people who were simply trying to make a living. His case had been used as an example in drug treatment programs, demonstrating how addiction could lead to increasingly serious criminal behavior that destroyed multiple lives. The file contained updates on the recovery of the affected businesses and neighborhoods, reports on community meetings and initiatives designed to rebuild confidence and economic activity. Local business associations had worked with police to improve security and communication, creating partnerships that had made the area less attractive to future criminals while helping business owners feel more secure and supported by their community. Detective Chun found these recovery efforts encouraging, evidence that communities could emerge stronger from traumatic experiences when they responded with cooperation and mutual support rather than isolation and fear. The robbers' crimes had certainly caused real harm, had created economic losses and psychological trauma that had lasted long after his arrest. But the community's response had demonstrated resilience and solidarity that had ultimately made the area more secure and prosperous than it had been before the crime spree. She closed the robbery file and pulled another, this one involving a hate crime that had targeted a family because of their ethnicity and religion. The crime had occurred during a period of increased racial tension in the community, when economic stress and political polarization had created an atmosphere where some people felt justified in expressing their prejudices through violence and intimidation. Family had been targeted because they were recent immigrants who practiced a minority religion and whose appearance and customs made them easily identifiable as outsiders to people who resented their presence in the community. The hate crime had involved vandalism of their home and business, threatening phone calls and letters, and eventually physical assault that had sent the father to the hospital with serious injuries. The investigation had been complicated by the victim's initial reluctance to report the crimes, based on their previous experience in their home country where police were not trusted and where reporting crimes could lead to further victimization. They had been afraid that seeking help from authorities would make their situation worse, would identify them as troublemakers who deserved whatever harassment they received from their neighbors. Detective Chun read through the patient work that had been required to gain the family's trust and encourage their cooperation with the investigation. Police had worked with community leaders and immigrant advocacy organizations to demonstrate that they took the crime seriously and were committed to protecting all community members regardless of their background or beliefs. The investigation had required cultural sensitivity and language assistance that had challenged the department's traditional approaches to victim interviews and evidence gathering. The perpetrators had been identified through a combination of physical evidence and witness testimony from community members who had been troubled by the escalating harassment and who had eventually found the courage to come forward with information. The case had revealed a small group of individuals who had been responsible for most of the harassment, people who had used the family as a target for their broader frustrations with economic and social changes they didn't understand or accept. The hate crime prosecutions had resulted in significant sentences that reflected both the seriousness of the specific crimes and their broader impact on community safety and cohesion. The perpetrators had been required to participate in educational programs designed to challenge their prejudices and help them understand the harm they had caused, not just to their immediate victims, but to the entire community's reputation and character. The case had also led to the development of hate crime response protocols that improved the department's ability to investigate such crimes and support their victims. Training programs had been implemented to help officers recognize and respond appropriately to bias-motivated crimes, and partnerships had been established with community organizations that could provide cultural and linguistic support during investigations and prosecutions. The targeted family had eventually prospered in their new community, building a successful business and becoming active participants in civic and religious organizations. Their experience had been traumatic, but their perseverance and the community's eventual support had demonstrated that hate and prejudice could be overcome through determination and solidarity. Their success had also served as an example to other immigrants and minorities who faced similar challenges, showing that justice was possible even when initial circumstances seemed hopeless. As Detective Chun continued reading, she found herself increasingly moved by the stories of resilience and recovery that emerged from even the most disturbing cases. Crime caused real harm, created genuine trauma and loss that could never be completely healed. But the criminal justice system at its best did more than simply punish wrongdoing. It facilitated understanding, healing, and positive change that could transform tragic experiences into opportunities for growth and improvement. The basement around her had grown completely quiet, the sounds from the street above having faded to nothing as the city settled into the deepest hours of night. She could hear only the gentle hum of ventilation systems and the occasional creak of settling foundations, sounds that provided a peaceful backdrop to her exploration of human stories that had been carefully documented and preserved for posterity. She pulled one more file from the archives, this one involving the case of elder abuse that had been discovered when a bank teller had become suspicious about large withdrawals from an elderly customer's account. The investigation had revealed systematic financial and emotional abuse by the customer's own grandson, someone who had been trusted to help manage his grandmother's affairs, but who had instead exploited her vulnerability for his own benefit. The abuse had continued for years before being detected, with the grandson gradually isolating his grandmother from other family members and friends who might have noticed her declining condition or questioned his management of her finances. He had convinced her that other relatives were trying to steal from her, had moved her to a location where he could monitor her contacts with the outside world, and had systematically drained her savings while neglecting her basic needs for food, medical care, and social interaction. The investigation had been challenging because the victim had been coached to distrust law enforcement and had initially refused to cooperate with investigators. She had been taught to believe that any intervention would result in her being placed in a nursing home, where she would be mistreated and forgotten. And she had protected her grandson even as he continued to abuse and exploit her. Breaking through this manipulation had required patience and skill from investigators who understood the complex psychology of elder abuse and the barriers that prevented victims from seeking help. Detective Chun read through the careful documentation of how investigators had gradually earned the elderly woman's trust and helped her understand that seeking help would improve, rather than worsen her situation. The process had involved social workers and medical professionals who could assess her condition and provide services she needed, as well as victim advocates who could explain her rights and options without pressuring her to make decisions she wasn't ready to make. The case had been resolved with the grandson's conviction for elder abuse and financial fraud, crimes that carried significant penalties because of his exploitation of a vulnerable adult's trust and dependency. The sentence had included restitution orders that would never fully compensate for what had been stolen, but it had also included provisions for the grandmother's ongoing care and protection from further abuse. The elderly woman had been relocated to assisted living facility where she could receive appropriate medical care and social interaction while maintaining as much independence as possible. Her recovery had been gradual but significant, as proper nutrition and medical care had improved her physical condition and social interaction, had helped restore her confidence and emotional well-being. She had reconnected with other family members who had been excluded by her grandson, rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by his manipulation and control. The case had contributed to improved training for bank employees and other professionals who might encounter signs of elder abuse, helping them recognize warning signs and understand their role in reporting suspected abuse to appropriate authorities. The investigation had also led to better coordination between law enforcement, social services, and medical professionals who needed to work together to protect vulnerable adults from exploitation and abuse. Detective Chun closed the elder abuse file and sat quietly in the peaceful basement, surrounded by thousands of similar stories that documented humanity's capacity for both cruelty and compassion, for both harm and healing. Each file represented a complete narrative of crime and consequence, investigation and resolution, trauma and recovery. Together, they formed a vast library of human experience that demonstrated the complexity of justice and the possibility for positive change even in the aftermath of terrible crimes. The archives represented more than just successful prosecutions or closed cases. They documented the evolution of a society's understanding of crime and punishment, the gradual development of more sophisticated approaches to preventing crime and supporting victims, and the persistent human belief that order could be imposed on chaos through careful investigation and thoughtful application of law and procedure. As the night deepened toward dawn, Detective Chen felt a deep sense of peace and purpose in her work. The cases in these archives represented the best of human nature responding to the worst, communities coming together to seek justice and healing in the aftermath of trauma and loss. Each file was a testament to the possibility that even the most disturbing human behaviors could be understood and addressed through patience, skill, and commitment to the principles of justice and human dignity. She returned the final file to its place among thousands of others and made her way quietly through the basement corridors toward the exit. Behind her, the archives continued their silent vigil, preserving the stories of crime solved and justice served, waiting for the next detective who might find comfort and inspiration in the accumulated wisdom of those who had faced similar challenges and had never given up on the possibility of making things right. Asterisk. The morning shift at the downtown precinct began the same way it had for decades, with officers gathering around metal desks that bore the scratches and stains of countless reports, countless late nights, countless moments when someone had to find the right words to describe something that defied easy explanation. Detective Maria Santos had been part of this routine for 8 years now, but she never lost her appreciation for the quiet professionalism that marked the beginning of each day's work. The reports came in steadily, a constant flow of human experience reduced to forms and procedures that had been refined over generations of police work. Each incident required its own careful documentation, its own attention to detail, its own place in the vast system that tracked and categorized the ways people failed each other and the ways society responded to those failures. She pulled the first case file of the day, a domestic disturbance that had been reported the previous evening but had required follow-up investigation before charges could be filed. The initial responding officers had completed their reports with the thorough attention that such cases demanded, documenting not just the immediate incident, but the broader pattern of behavior that had led to police intervention. The report began with basic information recorded in careful handwriting, the kind of penmanship that belonged to officers who understood that their words might be read in courtrooms months or years later, that their documentation might be the foundation upon which justice was built or denied. The date, time, and location were noted with precision, followed by the names and addresses of everyone involved, their relationships to each other, and their accounts of what had occurred. Detective Santos read through the primary officer's narrative, a description of the scene that had greeted responding units when they arrived at the residential address. The front door had been standing open, revealing a living room where furniture had been overturned and personal belongings scattered across the floor. The reporting officer had noted the presence of broken glass from a picture frame, a lamp that had been knocked from its table, and cushions that had been thrown from the sofa. The residents had been separated immediately upon police arrival, a standard procedure designed to prevent further escalation while officers gathered information about what had occurred. The woman had been crying but cooperative, answering questions in a voice that was described as shaky but clear. The man had been agitated and defensive, challenging the officer's right to be in his home and demanding that they leave immediately. Both parties had provided statements about the evening's events, accounts that differed in their details but agreed on the basic facts of an argument that had escalated from verbal disagreement to physical confrontation. The woman had been trying to leave the house when the man had blocked her path, leading to a struggle during which furniture had been knocked over, and the woman had sustained bruises on her arms and wrists. Detective Santos examined the photographs that had been taken at the scene, images that documented both the physical evidence of the altercation and the injuries sustained by the victim. The pictures had been taken with the careful attention to lighting and detail that marked experienced officers who understood the importance of preserving evidence that might be crucial during prosecution. Each photograph was labeled with information about what it depicted and when it had been taken. The woman's injuries had been documented with particular care, photographed from multiple angles to show the extent and pattern of bruising that suggested she had been grabbed forcibly during the struggle. The medical report from the emergency room visit that had followed police intervention provided additional documentation of injuries that were consistent with the account she had given to officers. Man's statement had been recorded verbatim, preserving his exact words even when they revealed anger and attitudes that would likely influence how prosecutors approached the case. He had admitted to grabbing the woman's arms, but had claimed he was only trying to prevent her from leaving during an argument, that he had not intended to hurt her, and that any injuries were accidental rather than deliberate. Detective Santos reviewed the background information that had been gathered about both parties. Records that revealed a pattern of previous domestic disturbance, calls to the same address over a period of several months. The earlier incidents had not resulted in arrests, but they had been carefully documented and had established a history of escalating conflict that provided context for the current charges. The case file included statements from neighbors who had heard shouting and sounds of furniture being moved, testimony that could corroborate the victim's account of what had occurred. One neighbor had been specific about hearing a woman's voice saying, "Let me go," repeatedly, words that supported charges of unlawful restraint in addition to the assault charges that were being considered. The investigation had continued beyond the initial response, with detectives conducting follow-up interviews designed to gather additional evidence and ensure that all aspects of the incident had been properly documented. The woman had been interviewed again after she had time to process what had occurred, providing additional details about the relationship's history and the pattern of behavior that had led to the violent confrontation. Her statement revealed months of increasing isolation and control, behavior that fit established patterns of domestic abuse even though previous incidents had not risen to the level of criminal charges. The man had gradually restricted her contact with friends and family, had monitored her communications and activities, and had used emotional manipulation to make her doubt her own perceptions of his behavior. Detective Santos read through the victim advocate's report, documentation of the support services that had been offered, and the safety planning that had been conducted to protect the woman from potential retaliation. The advocate had helped her understand the legal process that would follow, had connected her with counseling resources, and had assisted with arrangements for temporary housing that would keep her safe while charges were being processed. The case represented the kind of careful documentation that made successful prosecution possible in domestic violence cases, where victims often faced pressure to recant their statements, and where evidence could be crucial in overcoming the manipulation and intimidation that characterized abusive relationships. Each report had been completed with attention to detail that reflected officers' understanding of the complex dynamics involved in such cases. The defendant's criminal history had been thoroughly researched, revealing previous arrests for similar offenses in other jurisdictions. The pattern that emerged suggested someone whose behavior was escalating over time, whose relationships consistently involved conflict and control that eventually led to police intervention. This background information would be crucial for prosecutors, who needed to demonstrate that the current incident was part of a broader pattern, rather than an isolated occurrence. Detective Santos completed her review of the domestic violence case and moved on to the next file, a burglary report that required additional investigation before charges could be finalized. The initial report had been filed by homeowners who had returned from vacation to find their house had been entered and several items stolen, including electronics, jewelry, and cash that had been kept in a bedroom safe. The reporting officers had documented the scene with methodical care, noting the point of entry where a basement window had been forced open and the path the burglar had apparently taken through the house. Each room had been photographed and described, with particular attention to areas where items had been disturbed or stolen. The homeowners had provided detailed inventories of missing property, including serial numbers for electronic equipment and descriptions of jewelry that might be identifiable if recovered. Investigation had revealed that the burglar had been familiar with the house's layout and had known where valuable items were likely to be found. The safe had been opened using tools that suggested some knowledge of how such devices operated, and the selection of stolen items indicated someone who understood their resale value and portability. These details suggested that the crime had been committed by someone with experience, rather than an opportunistic amateur. Fingerprint evidence had been collected from multiple locations throughout the house, particularly from surfaces near the point of entry and around areas where the most valuable items had been stored. The quality of the prints varied, but several were clear enough for comparison against databases of known offenders. The methodical collection and preservation of this evidence had been documented with photographs and detailed descriptions of where each print had been found. Detective Santos examined the forensic reports that had been generated from the physical evidence, technical documents that described the scientific analysis of fingerprints, DNA samples, and trace evidence that had been collected at the scene. Each report included detailed explanations of the testing procedures that had been used and the statistical significance of any matches that had been identified. The investigation had also included interviews with neighbors who might have observed suspicious activity during the time when the homeowners were away. Several residents had noticed an unfamiliar vehicle in the area on multiple occasions. Descriptions that were carefully recorded and compared against motor vehicle records that might help identify potential suspects. The case had been solved when fingerprint evidence had matched someone in the criminal database, leading to the identification and arrest of a suspect with a history of similar crimes. The arrest had occurred several weeks after the initial burglary, following careful surveillance and investigation that had confirmed the suspect's involvement and had ensured that sufficient evidence was available for prosecution. The suspect's statement had been recorded during a lengthy interview process, documentation that revealed both his admission to the current burglary and information about other similar crimes he had committed in the area. His cooperation with investigators had led to the recovery of some stolen property and had provided information that helped solve several other cases that had been under investigation. Detective Santos read through the restitution calculations that had been prepared for sentencing. Detailed accounting of the financial losses suffered by the victims and the costs associated with repairing damage caused during the break-in. The figures included not just the value of stolen items but also the expenses for improving security systems and the emotional costs associated with feeling unsafe in one's own home. The case file documented the complete life cycle of a criminal investigation, from initial report through arrest and prosecution to final disposition and restitution. Each step had been carefully recorded, creating a comprehensive record that served both immediate investigative needs and long-term archival purposes. The documentation would become part of the permanent record, available for reference in future cases or appeals that might arise years later. She moved on to a third case, a fraud investigation that had been ongoing for several months and had generated hundreds of pages of documentation as investigators worked to untangle a complex scheme involving multiple victims and jurisdictions. The case had begun with a single complaint from an elderly man who had been convinced to invest his retirement savings in what he believed was a legitimate business opportunity, but which had turned out to be an elaborate deception. The initial report had been filed by the victim's daughter, who had become suspicious when her father had mentioned making a large investment with people she had never heard of. Her attempts to research the investment company had revealed inconsistencies in their claimed credentials and business history, leading her to contact police about what she suspected was a fraudulent scheme targeting vulnerable seniors. Detective Santos read through the victim's statement, a detailed account of how he had been approached by someone claiming to represent an investment firm that specialized in helping retirees maximize their income through conservative, low-risk investments. The approach had been sophisticated, involving professionally printed materials, references to legitimate financial publications, and testimonials from supposed previous clients who had achieved impressive returns on their investments. The fraud had been executed with careful attention to psychological manipulation, targeting the victim's fears about inflation and market volatility while presenting the investment opportunity as a solution to financial anxieties that many seniors faced. The perpetrators had built trust gradually, starting with small investments that had generated modest returns before suggesting larger commitments that would supposedly provide greater security and income. The investigation had expanded rapidly as detectives discovered that the same scheme had victimized dozens of other seniors across multiple states. Each case had been documented separately, but patterns had emerged that revealed a coordinated operation involving multiple individuals who had specific roles in identifying targets, building relationships with victims, and extracting money through increasingly sophisticated deceptions. The documentation in the case file revealed the methodical approach that investigators had taken to mapping the criminal organization and gathering evidence that could support prosecution of all involved parties. Financial records had been subpoenaed from banks and investment firms. Phone records had been analyzed to establish communication patterns, and victim interviews had been conducted to understand how the scheme had operated and evolved over time. Detective Santos examined the organizational chart that investigators had created to show the relationships between different participants. In the fraud scheme, the diagram revealed a hierarchy that included recruiters who identified potential victims, sales representatives who built relationships and extracted initial investments, and administrators who managed the flow of money and maintained the illusion that legitimate investments were being made. The scheme had been sophisticated enough to sustain itself for several years, generating millions of dollars in fraudulent investments while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy through carefully constructed documentation and periodic small payments to victims that created the impression their investments were performing as promised. The perpetrators had understood that maintaining victims' confidence was crucial to the long-term success of their operation. Investigation had been complicated by the fact that many victims had been reluctant to admit they had been defrauded, either because they were embarrassed by their vulnerability to the scheme or because they continued to hope that their investments might eventually prove legitimate. Investigators had worked patiently to overcome this reluctance, helping victims understand that their cooperation was essential to stopping the fraud and potentially recovering some of their losses. The case had been resolved through a coordinated effort involving law enforcement agencies in multiple jurisdictions, resulting in the arrest and prosecution of 17 individuals who had participated in the fraud scheme at various levels. The prosecution had required extensive documentation of each defendant's role in the operation, evidence that had been gathered through months of careful investigation and analysis of financial records, communications, and victim testimony. Detective Santos reviewed the restitution orders that had been entered as part of the sentencing process, calculations that attempted to determine how much money each defendant should pay to compensate victims for their losses. The amounts were substantial, but investigators had discovered that most of the fraudulent proceeds had been spent on luxury items and gambling, making full restitution unlikely even with lengthy payment plans. The case had led to improved coordination between law enforcement agencies investigating financial crimes targeting seniors, as well as enhanced education programs designed to help elderly individuals recognize and avoid similar schemes. The investigation had also resulted in regulatory changes that made it more difficult for fraudulent investment operations to maintain the appearance of legitimacy through fake credentials and documentation. As Detective Santos completed her review of the fraud case, she reflected on the enormous amount of work that had been required to document and prosecute such a complex criminal enterprise. Each victim's experience had been carefully recorded. Each financial transaction had been traced and analyzed, and each defendant's role had been established through patient accumulation of evidence that could withstand the scrutiny of defense, attorneys, and appellate courts. The documentation process was labor-intensive and time-consuming, but it was essential to ensuring that justice could be served and that similar crimes could be prevented in the future. Each report contributed to a growing body of knowledge about how financial frauds operated and how they could be most effectively investigated and prosecuted. She pulled another case file, this one involving a hit-and-run accident that had been solved through a combination of traditional detective work and modern forensic techniques. The initial report had been filed by responding officers who had found the victim lying in a residential street, critically injured but still conscious enough to provide some information about what had occurred. The victim had been walking her dog in the early evening when she had been struck by a vehicle that had immediately fled the scene, without stopping to render aid or report the accident. Witnesses had provided conflicting descriptions of the vehicle, but all agreed that it had been traveling at high speed and had made no attempt to avoid the collision or stop afterward. The investigation had begun with a careful examination of the accident scene, with officers documenting tire marks, debris patterns, and other physical evidence that might help identify the vehicle involved. The victim's injuries had been photographed and documented, both to preserve evidence of the crime and to ensure that appropriate medical treatment could be provided. Detective Santos read through the medical reports that describe the extent of the victim's injuries, clinical documentation that would be crucial for establishing the severity of the crime and the appropriate charges that should be filed. The victim had sustained multiple fractures and internal injuries that had required emergency surgery and months of rehabilitation. Injuries that would have permanent effects on her mobility and quality of life. The investigation had expanded to include canvas interviews with residents of the surrounding area, systematic efforts to identify anyone who might have witnessed the accident or observed suspicious activity in the hours before or after the collision. Several residents had heard the sound of the impact and had come outside to help, but none had seen the vehicle clearly enough to provide a definitive identification. The breakthrough in the case had come from forensic analysis of paint chips and glass fragments that had been left at the scene. These materials had been analyzed to determine the make, model, and color of the vehicle involved. Information that had been used to narrow the search to specific types of cars that might have been in the area at the time of the accident. The case had been solved when a tip from the public had led investigators to a damaged vehicle that matched the forensic evidence from the accident scene. The vehicle's owner had initially denied involvement, but confronted with physical evidence that linked his car to the collision, he had eventually admitted to being the driver who had fled the scene. His statement had revealed that the hit and run had not been intentional, that he had been distracted while driving and had not seen the victim until the moment of impact. His decision to flee had been motivated by panic and the realization that he had been drinking earlier in the evening, making him afraid of the consequences he would face if he remained at the scene and was tested for alcohol impairment. Detective Santos examined the chemical analysis reports that had confirmed the presence of alcohol in the driver's system at the time of his arrest, evidence that supported additional charges beyond just leaving the scene of an accident. The combination of impaired driving and failure to render aid had resulted in felony charges that carried significant penalties, reflecting both the seriousness of the victim's injuries and the driver's decision to prioritize his own interests over the victim's need for immediate medical attention. Detective Santos found herself impressed by the dedication and professionalism that was evident in each case file she reviewed. The officers and detectives who had worked these cases had shown remarkable commitment to thorough investigation and careful documentation, understanding that their work would be scrutinized by prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and juries who needed complete and accurate information to ensure that justice was served. The documentation process was more than just bureaucratic requirement. It was the foundation upon which the entire criminal justice system operated. Each report, each photograph, each witness statement contributed to a comprehensive record that preserved the truth about what had occurred and ensured that evidence would be available whenever it was needed, whether for immediate prosecution or for appeals and reviews that might occur years later. She pulled a case involving check fraud that had been committed by someone who had stolen mail from residential mailboxes to obtain personal information and blank checks that could be altered and cashed. The investigation had required cooperation with postal inspectors and bank security personnel, coordination that had been carefully documented to show how different agencies had worked together to solve the crime. The fraud scheme had been relatively simple but effective, involving the theft of mail from multiple neighborhoods, followed by the alteration of legitimate checks to change the payee and amount. The perpetrator had been skilled at forgery and had understood enough about banking procedures to time the cashing of altered checks to minimize the chances of immediate detection. Detective Santos read through the banking records, that had been subpoenaed as part of the investigation. Financial documents that showed the pattern of fraudulent transactions and helped establish the total amount of losses caused by the scheme. The records had been analyzed to identify common elements that linked different fraudulent checks to the same perpetrator, evidence that had been crucial for establishing the scope of the criminal activity. The case had been solved through a combination of surveillance footage from banks where fraudulent checks had been cashed and fingerprint evidence that had been recovered from some of the altered documents. The identification had led to the arrest of someone with a history of similar crimes, and his confession had provided information that helped recover some of the stolen funds and solve related cases in neighboring jurisdictions. Documentation showed how the investigation had expanded beyond the immediate crime to identify other victims who had not yet realized they had been targeted. Banks had been contacted to alert them about the fraud scheme, and potential victims had been notified about the theft of their personal information so they could take steps to protect themselves from further victimization. Case had resulted in federal prosecution because of the involvement of mail theft and interstate banking systems, requiring coordination between local and federal authorities that had been carefully documented throughout the investigation. The defendant had been sentenced to federal prison and had been ordered to pay restitution to all identified victims. Although recovery of the full amount of losses had been unlikely given his limited financial resources. As Detective Santos continued her review, she began to appreciate how each case contributed to the broader understanding of criminal behavior and investigative techniques. The documentation showed how crimes evolved over time, how perpetrators adapted their methods to avoid detection, and how law enforcement agencies developed new approaches to investigation and prevention. The files also revealed the human cost of crime, the way that criminal behavior affected not just immediate victims but families and communities that were forced to deal with the aftermath of violation and loss. Each case represented real people whose lives had been disrupted by someone else's poor decisions, people who deserved the careful attention and professional investigation that was evident in every report she reviewed. She pulled a file involving a series of vehicle thefts that had been committed by juveniles who had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for stealing and reselling cars. The investigation had been complicated by the defendants' ages and the legal protections that applied to juvenile offenders, requiring careful coordination with family court and social service agencies that were involved in addressing the underlying issues that had led to the criminal behavior. The case documentation showed how the thefts had escalated from joyriding to organized theft for profit, with the juveniles developing connections to adult criminals who purchased stolen vehicles and either resold them or used them for parts. The investigation had revealed a criminal network that exploited young people's willingness to take risks in exchange for relatively small amounts of money. Detective Santos read through the social history reports that had been prepared for each juvenile defendant, documents that provided context about their family situations, educational backgrounds, and the social factors that had contributed to their involvement in criminal activity. The reports painted a picture of young people who had limited opportunities and who had been attracted to crime as a way to achieve status and financial gain that seemed impossible to obtain through legitimate means. The resolution of the case had emphasized rehabilitation rather than punishment, with sentences that included community service, counseling, and educational programs designed to address the underlying issues that had led to criminal behavior. The approach reflected the juvenile justice system's focus on helping young offenders develop the skills and attitudes they needed to become productive members of society. The documentation also showed how the case had led to broader community efforts to address the conditions that made young people vulnerable to recruitment by criminal organizations. Schools had implemented programs designed to provide alternative activities and opportunities, and community organizations had developed mentoring programs that connected at-risk youth with positive adult role models. As the day progressed, Detective Santos found herself developing a deep appreciation for the complexity and thoroughness of the documentation process that supported the criminal justice system. Each case file represented not just the resolution of a particular crime, but the careful preservation of knowledge and experience that would benefit future investigations and help prevent similar crimes from occurring. The report showed how the system had evolved over time, incorporating new technologies and techniques while maintaining the fundamental commitment to thorough investigation and careful documentation that ensured justice could be served. Each case contributed to a growing body of knowledge about criminal behavior and effective investigative practices that would benefit law enforcement agencies and communities. For years to come, she completed her review of the juvenile vehicle theft case and pulled another file. This one involving a workplace harassment complaint that had escalated to criminal charges when the behavior had become threatening and had interfered with the victim's ability to perform her job. The investigation had required careful coordination with human resources personnel and had involved complex questions about the intersection of employment law and criminal law. The case had begun with internal complaints within a large corporation, documented through the company's human resources procedures before being referred to law enforcement when the behavior had crossed the line from inappropriate workplace conduct to criminal harassment. The documentation showed how workplace investigations and criminal investigations could complement each other while serving different purposes and following different procedures. Detective Santos read through the victim's detailed statement about the pattern of harassment she had experienced, behavior that had started with inappropriate comments and had gradually escalated to stalking, and threats that had made her fear for her safety. The harassment had continued, despite internal disciplinary actions, and had ultimately required criminal prosecution to protect the victim and hold the perpetrator accountable for his actions. The investigation had required analysis of electronic communications, surveillance footage, and witness statements from co-workers who had observed the harassment or had been told about it by the victim. The evidence had painted a clear picture of systematic behavior designed to intimidate and control the victim, behavior that had created a hostile work environment and had interfered with her ability to perform her job effectively. The case had been resolved with a guilty plea to harassment and stalking charges, sentences that had included both criminal penalties and restraining orders designed to protect the victim from further contact. The resolution had also led to changes in the company's policies and procedures for addressing workplace harassment, improvements that had been designed to prevent similar situations from developing in the future. The documentation showed how criminal prosecution had been just one part of a broader response to workplace harassment that had included civil remedies, employment consequences, and institutional changes designed to create a safer and more respectful work environment. The case demonstrated how different legal systems could work together to address complex problems that affected both individual victims and broader institutional cultures. As Detective Santos concluded her review of the workplace harassment case, she reflected on the enormous variety of human behavior and social problems that were documented in the case files she had examined. Each crime represented a different type of failure in human relationships or social institutions, and each investigation represented society's attempt to understand and address those failures through careful investigation and appropriate consequences. The documentation process was essential to ensuring that lessons learned from individual cases could be applied to prevent similar crimes in the future and to improve the systems ability to serve victims and hold offenders accountable. Each report contributed to the accumulated wisdom of the criminal justice system, knowledge that would be available to future investigators and prosecutors who faced similar challenges. The careful attention to detail that was evident in every case file she had reviewed demonstrated the professionalism and dedication of the officers and detectives who had worked these cases. Their commitment to thorough investigation and accurate documentation had created a comprehensive record that preserved the truth about what had occurred and ensured that justice could be served both immediately and in any future proceedings that might arise. Detective Santos organized the completed case files and prepared them for filing in the permanent archives, where they would join thousands of similar documents that chronicled the ongoing efforts of law enforcement agencies to maintain order and protect innocent people from those who would harm them. Each file represented a complete story of crime and consequence, investigation and resolution, carefully preserved for future reference and study. The basement archives, where these files would eventually be stored, represented more than just a record-keeping system. They were a testament to society's commitment to the rule of law and the belief that justice could be achieved through careful investigation and fair application of legal principles. Each case contributed to that larger purpose, part of humanity's ongoing effort to create a more just and peaceful world through the patient work of documentation and investigation. Asterisk. The building's third sublevel had been forgotten by most who worked in the floors above, a place where the oldest case files rested in perfect rows of gray metal cabinets that had been manufactured decades ago, when the city was smaller and its crimes seemed simpler. Detective James Morrison had discovered these deeper archives during his second year with the department, drawn by curiosity about cases that predated digital records and lived only in the careful handwriting of officers whose careers had ended long before he had begun his own. The fluorescent lights in this section had been replaced with newer fixtures that cast a warmer glow, creating an atmosphere more conducive to the quiet contemplation that these older cases seemed to invite. The air was drier here, maintained at levels that preserved paper and ink that had already survived longer than their creators had originally expected. Each cabinet contained stories that had once filled newspapers and dominated conversations but had now settled into the peaceful silence of resolved history. He pulled a file from 1967. The tab marked in the careful print that had been standard before typewriters became commonplace in police work. The case involved a series of burglaries that had puzzled investigators for months before being solved through the kind of methodical police work that relied on shoe leather and careful observation rather than forensic science or computer databases. The first report in the file was written in fountain pen ink that had faded to a soft brown but remained perfectly legible, a testament to the quality of materials that had been used in an era when permanence was assumed rather than planned for. The handwriting belonged to Sergeant William Hayes, whose signature appeared on hundreds of cases from that era, a man who had apparently taken pride in the clarity and completeness of his documentation. Detective Morrison read through Sergeant Hayes's initial report, which described the first in what would become a series of residential burglaries that had targeted middle-class homes in a neighborhood that had been considered safe and secure. The burglar had been selective in his targets, choosing houses that were temporarily unoccupied and taking only items that could be easily transported and quickly sold. The investigation had been conducted without the benefit of security cameras, alarm systems, or DNA analysis, relying instead on witness interviews, fingerprint comparisons that required manual matching, and the kind of intuitive police work that came from years of experience observing human behavior. Sergeant Hayes had documented each step of the investigation with meticulous care, creating a record that revealed how crimes were solved. In an era that demanded different skills from law enforcement officers, the burglar had been caught through community vigilance and patient surveillance rather than technological breakthrough. Neighbors had organized informal watch groups, and their observations had eventually identified suspicious activity that led to the arrest of someone who had been casing houses during daytime hours while residents were at work. His capture had ended a crime spree that had created anxiety throughout the affected neighborhood. Detective Morrison found himself fascinated by the different pace of investigation that was evident in these older cases. Without instant communication and rapid forensic analysis, cases had developed more slowly, requiring sustained attention over weeks or months as investigators gradually accumulated evidence and built cases through persistent effort. Rather than technological shortcuts, the resolution of the 1967 burglary case had been straightforward once the perpetrator was identified. But the documentation showed how much work had been required to reach that point. Every lead had been followed up personally, every witness had been interviewed face-to-face, and every piece of evidence had been processed through procedures that required human expertise. Rather than machine analysis, he pulled another file from the same era, this one involving a hit-and-run accident that had been solved through the kind of detective work that seemed almost quaint by contemporary standards. The investigation had been led by Detective Robert Chun, whose approach had been methodical and patient, focused on gathering physical evidence and witness testimony that could be presented effectively in court. The accident had occurred on a rainy evening when visibility had been poor and traffic had been heavy. The victim had been crossing a street when struck by a vehicle that had immediately fled the scene, leaving behind only tire marks and the testimony of witnesses who had seen the collision but had been unable to identify the responsible vehicle with certainty. Detective Shun had begun his investigation by carefully measuring and photographing the accident scene, documenting tire tracks and debris patterns that might provide clues about the type of vehicle involved. His reports showed the careful attention to physical evidence that had been essential. In an era before surveillance cameras provided electronic witnesses to most traffic accidents, the case had been solved through systematic canvass of auto repair shops and part suppliers. Investigation that had eventually identified a vehicle that had been brought in for repairs, consistent with involvement in the hit and run. The owner had initially denied involvement, but had eventually confessed when confronted with evidence that linked his car to the accident scene. Detective Morrison was struck by the amount of time and effort that had been required to solve what would now be a relatively straightforward case. Without computer databases and instant communication, every aspect of the investigation had required personal attention and manual processes that made each case a significant investment of resources and personnel. The documentation from these older cases revealed a different relationship between police and community, an era when officers had been more integrated into neighborhoods and had relied heavily on personal relationships and local knowledge to solve crimes. The cases showed evidence of long-term partnerships between police and residents, cooperation that had been built through years of mutual respect and shared commitment to community safety. He pulled a file from 1962, a domestic violence case that had been handled very differently than similar cases would be addressed today. The documentation showed how social attitudes and legal procedures had evolved over the decades, reflecting changing understanding of family violence and the appropriate role of law enforcement in addressing domestic conflicts. The case had been initiated by neighbors who had called police about repeated disturbances at a nearby residence, complaints that had led to multiple visits by officers who had attempted to mediate disputes rather than making arrests. The approach had reflected the prevailing belief that family conflicts were private matters that should be resolved through counseling and social pressure, rather than criminal prosecution. Detective Morrison read through the reports that documented several months of police intervention in what was clearly an escalating pattern of domestic abuse. The officers involved had been well-intentioned, but their attempts to resolve the situation through informal mediation had been ineffective in stopping violence that had gradually become more severe and frequent. The case had eventually resulted in criminal charges only after the violence had escalated to the point where the victim had required hospitalization for injuries that could not be ignored or minimized. Even then, the prosecution had been complicated by social attitudes that blamed victims for staying in abusive relationships, and that viewed domestic violence as less serious than similar crimes committed between strangers. Resolution had been unsatisfactory by contemporary standards, with the abuser receiving a suspended sentence and probation that had included counseling requirements that were poorly supervised and largely ineffective. The victim had been left without adequate protection or support, expected to rebuild her life with minimal assistance from social service agencies that had not yet developed specialized programs for domestic violence survivors. The programs for domestic violence survivors. Case file included a note added years later by a different officer who had investigated the death of the same victim in a subsequent domestic violence incident. Documentation that showed how the system's failure to adequately address the earlier case had contributed to a tragedy that might have been prevented with more effective intervention. Detective Morrison found these older domestic violence cases particularly troubling, evidence of how social attitudes and institutional responses had once failed victims in ways that were now recognized as unacceptable. The evolution in how such cases were handled represented genuine progress in the criminal justice system's understanding of domestic violence and its responsibility to protect vulnerable individuals. He pulled another file, this one from the 1950s, involving fraud that had targeted members of a particular ethnic community who had been reluctant to report the crimes because of their distrust of law enforcement and their unfamiliarity with American legal systems. The case showed how immigrant communities had been vulnerable to exploitation and how police had gradually learned to work more effectively with diverse populations. The fraud had involved someone who had claimed to provide immigration assistance and other legal services to recent immigrants, collecting fees for services that were never provided and using his victim's unfamiliarity with American institutions to avoid detection for several years. The perpetrator had exploited cultural and language barriers to maintain his scheme. Knowing that his victims were unlikely to report him to authorities they distrusted or feared, the investigation had been led by Detective Maria Rodriguez, one of the first Hispanic officers in the department, whose language skills and cultural knowledge had been essential to gaining the trust of victims who had been reluctant to cooperate with police. Her reports showed the patience and sensitivity that had been required to overcome years of mistrust and fear, gradually building relationships that made successful prosecution possible. Detective Morrison was impressed by Detective Rodriguez's approach to the case, which had involved extensive community outreach and education that had gone far beyond traditional investigative techniques. She had worked with community leaders and immigrant advocacy organizations to explain how the American legal system could protect, rather than threaten, immigrants who had been victimized by crime. The case had been resolved with the conviction of the fraudster and the recovery of some stolen funds. But Detective Rodriguez's reports made clear that the real success had been in establishing trust between the police department and a community that had previously been isolated and vulnerable. Her work had led to improved communication and cooperation that had helped prevent similar crimes in the future. Documentation showed how effective police work required understanding of the communities being served, recognition that different populations had different needs, and concerns that affected their willingness to cooperate with law enforcement. The case had been groundbreaking in demonstrating how cultural competence could improve police effectiveness while building stronger relationships with diverse communities. As Detective Morrison continued his exploration of the older archives, he began to see patterns in how policing had evolved over the decades. The cases from earlier eras showed greater reliance on personal relationships and community knowledge, but they also revealed limitations in investigative techniques and legal procedures that had sometimes prevented justice from being served effectively. The progression from handwritten reports to typed documents to computerized records paralleled improvements in forensic science, communication technology, and legal procedures that had made modern police work more efficient and effective. But the older cases also showed qualities that were sometimes lost in contemporary policing: patience, community integration, and attention to the human dimensions of crime and investigation. He pulled a case from the 1940s, a murder investigation that had been solved through the kind of methodical investigation that had required months of patient work without the benefit of modern forensic techniques. The case had been led by Detective Thomas Walsh, whose reports revealed an investigative approach that relied heavily on psychology and human observation, rather than scientific analysis. The murder had occurred in a boarding house where the victim had been found dead in his room, apparently killed during a robbery that had gone wrong. The investigation had been complicated by the transient nature of the boarding house population and the limited physical evidence that had been available to investigators who lacked access to fingerprint databases or modern forensic laboratories. Detective Walsh had solved the case through systematic interviews with dozens of residents and former residents of the boarding house, gradually building a picture of relationships and conflicts that had led to the murder. His approach had been based on understanding human nature and motivation rather than technological analysis, skills that had been essential in an era when police work was more art than science. The documentation showed how Detective Walsh had gradually identified inconsistencies in witness statements and had used those discrepancies to focus his investigation on individuals who had both opportunity and motive to commit the crime. His patient questioning and careful analysis of human behavior had eventually led to a confession that had solved the case without any physical evidence linking the perpetrator to the crime. Morrison found himself admiring Detective Walsh's investigative skills, which had been based on careful observation and understanding of human psychology rather than reliance on technology. The case demonstrated how effective police work had always required understanding of people and their motivations, skills that remained relevant even in an era of advanced forensic science and electronic surveillance. The resolution of the 1940s murder case had been complete and satisfying, with the perpetrator receiving a sentence that had reflected the seriousness of his crime and the careful investigation that had led to his conviction. The case had been closed with the same attention to detail and documentation that characterized all the cases in these archives, preserving the record of successful police work for future reference. As the day progressed, Detective Morrison found himself drawn deeper into the peaceful atmosphere of the archives, where the accumulated weight of decades of police work created a sense of continuity and purpose that connected past and present. Each case represented the efforts of officers and detectives who had dedicated their careers to protecting the innocent and pursuing justice, work that had been carefully documented and preserved for posterity. The older cases revealed different challenges and different approaches, but they shared the same fundamental commitment to thorough investigation and careful documentation that characterized contemporary police work. The evolution of techniques and technology had improved the efficiency and accuracy of investigations, but the basic human dimensions of crime and justice remained constant across the decades. He pulled a case from the 1930s, a bank robbery that had been investigated during the Great Depression, when economic desperation had driven many people to commit crimes they would never have considered under normal circumstances. The case had been solved through cooperation between local and federal authorities, coordination that had been more difficult in an era of limited communication and transportation. The bank robbery had been committed by a group of men who had been unemployed for months and who had convinced themselves that robbing a bank was justified by their desperate circumstances. Their planning had been minimal and their execution had been amateurish, leading to their quick identification and arrest. Through witness testimony and physical evidence they had been too inexperienced to eliminate. Detective Morrison read through the statements given by the robbers, confessions that revealed men who had been driven to crime by economic circumstances beyond their control, but who had still made conscious choices to harm innocent people. Their statements showed the complex relationship between social conditions and individual responsibility that had been a constant theme in criminal justice. Throughout American history, the case had been resolved with sentences that had reflected both the seriousness of the crime and the mitigating circumstances that had motivated it. The approach had shown understanding of the economic conditions that had contributed to the crime while still holding the perpetrators accountable for their actions and protecting society from further victimization. Documentation from the Great Depression revealed how economic stress had affected both crime patterns and criminal justice responses, creating challenges that had required flexibility and understanding from police and courts who had dealt with unprecedented social conditions. The cases showed how the justice system had adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining its commitment to fairness and public safety. As Detective Morrison continued his exploration of the historical archives, he began to appreciate how each era had faced its own unique challenges while dealing with the timeless human problems that underlay most criminal behavior. The specific circumstances had changed over the decades, but the fundamental issues of desperation, greed, anger, and poor judgment had remained constant, requiring patient investigation and thoughtful responses from each generation of law enforcement officers. The documentation in these older cases was often more detailed and personal than contemporary reports, reflecting an era when officers had more time to develop relationships with victims and witnesses, and when investigations had proceeded at a more deliberate pace. The handwritten reports revealed personality and individual perspective in ways that standardized computer forms could not replicate. He pulled a file from the 1920s, a Prohibition-era case involving illegal alcohol sales that had been complicated by widespread public support for the criminals and widespread corruption among law enforcement officials. The case showed how police had struggled to enforce unpopular laws in an era when public opinion had been divided about what activities should be considered criminal. The investigation had been led by Agent Patrick Murphy, a federal prohibition officer whose reports revealed the difficulties faced by honest law enforcement officers who had been trying to enforce laws that many citizens and fellow officers had opposed or ignored. His work had required courage and integrity in the face of social pressure and professional isolation that had made effective enforcement extremely difficult. Detective Morrison found Agent Murphy's reports fascinating for their insight into how law enforcement had functioned during a period when the legitimacy of certain laws had been widely questioned. The case showed how individual officers had struggled to maintain professional standards while working in an environment where corruption and compromise had been common. The resolution of the Prohibition case had been successful in terms of arrests and convictions, but Agent Murphy's reports made clear that the broader problems of illegal alcohol sales and official corruption had continued despite his efforts. The case demonstrated the limitations of law enforcement when legal mandates were not supported by popular consensus or adequate resources. The Prohibition era cases in the archives provided valuable historical perspective on how law enforcement had adapted to changing social attitudes and legal frameworks. They showed how police work had been affected by political decisions and social movements that had been beyond the control of individual officers, who had still been expected to enforce whatever laws were on the books. As the afternoon deepened, Detective Morrison found himself absorbed in the peaceful rhythm of reading and reflection that these historical archives invited. Each case represented a complete story from a different era, offering insights into how American society and its justice system had evolved over the decades, while maintaining continuity in their fundamental commitment to law and order. The progression of cases through different decades revealed changes in criminal behavior, investigative techniques, and social attitudes that had shaped how justice was pursued and achieved. But they also showed constants that had persisted across generations: the dedication of individual officers, the importance of thorough investigation, and the need for careful documentation that preserved truth and enabled justice. He pulled one final case from the deepest part of the archives, a file from the 1910s that represented some of the oldest police work in the city's records. The case involved a fraud scheme that had targeted immigrants and minorities who had been vulnerable because of their limited English skills and their unfamiliarity with American business practices. The investigation had been conducted entirely through personal interviews and document analysis, without the benefit of fingerprints, photographs, or any of the scientific techniques that would later become standard in police work. Detective William O'Connor had solved the case through patient investigation and careful attention to details that had revealed patterns of deception and exploitation. Detective Morrison was struck by Detective O'Connor's thorough approach to documentation, which had preserved not only the facts of the case, but also insights into the social conditions that had made such crimes possible. His reports provided valuable historical perspective on how immigrant communities had been both vulnerable to exploitation and capable of organizing effective responses when given appropriate support. The resolution of the 1910s fraud case had been complete and satisfying, with the perpetrator receiving a sentence that had reflected the serious harm he had caused to vulnerable members of the community. Detective O'Connor's reports showed how effective police work had always required understanding of the communities being served and recognition of the social factors that made certain populations vulnerable to criminal exploitation. As Detective Morrison closed the final historical case file, he reflected on the remarkable continuity that connected police work across more than a century of American history. The specific techniques and technologies had changed dramatically, but the fundamental commitment to thorough investigation and careful documentation had remained constant, creating an unbroken chain of professional dedication that linked past and present. The archives represented more than just historical records. They were a testament to the accumulated wisdom of generations of law enforcement officers who had faced similar challenges and had developed effective responses through patient experimentation and careful observation. Each case had contributed to the growing body of knowledge that informed contemporary police work and would continue to guide future investigations. The peaceful atmosphere of the deep archives provided a perfect environment for reflection on the broader meaning and purpose of police work. Surrounded by thousands of cases that had been carefully investigated and documented, Detective Morrison felt connected to a tradition of public service that transcended individual careers and personal ambitions, a calling that had attracted dedicated professionals for more than a century. The handwritten reports from earlier eras revealed personalities and perspectives that had been shaped by different social conditions and professional challenges, but they also showed qualities that remained relevant to contemporary police work: patience, integrity, attention to detail, and commitment to justice that transcended personal convenience or popular opinion. As he prepared to leave the archives, Detective Morrison felt renewed appreciation for the profession he had chosen and for the institutional memory that these files represented. Each case had been someone's life work, someone's contribution to the ongoing effort to maintain order and protect innocent people from those who would harm them. The careful preservation of these records ensured that their efforts would not be forgotten and that their insights would continue to benefit future generations of law enforcement officers. The basement archives where these files were stored represented one of the city's most valuable resources, a repository of practical wisdom and professional knowledge that had been accumulated through decades of experience with every type of human behavior and criminal activity. The cases provided guidance for contemporary investigations while preserving historical perspective that helped put current challenges in broader context. Detective Morrison made his way through the quiet corridors toward the elevator that would return him to the active floors of the building, where current cases were being investigated with the benefit of modern technology and scientific techniques. But he carried with him a deeper appreciation for the continuity that connected all police work, past and present, and for the importance of careful documentation that would preserve today's investigations for future officers who might find guidance and inspiration in their careful work. The elevator doors closed behind him as he rose toward the present, but the peaceful atmosphere of the archives and the wisdom contained in thousands of carefully preserved case files would remain with him as he returned to his own investigations. The basement would continue its silent vigil, protecting the accumulated memory of generations of police work and waiting for the next officer who might find comfort and insight in the stories of those who had faced similar challenges and had never given up on the possibility of justice. Asterisk, the courthouse basement extended deeper into the earth than most people realized, its lowest levels containing rooms that had been built with the original structure in the 1920s and had been largely forgotten as court operations, had moved to more modern facilities above ground. Detective Lisa Park had discovered these forgotten chambers during her research into an old case, drawn by references and archived documents to evidence storage areas that no longer appeared on current building plans. The heavy wooden doors that lined these corridors bore brass nameplates that had been polished decades ago, but now carried the patina of age and neglect. Evidence Room C14, Witness Interview Suite 7, Jury Assembly Area D. The label spoke of a time when the courthouse had been the center of a smaller city's legal system, when trials had been more formal affairs, and when the physical spaces had been designed to inspire respect for the law and the judicial process. She pushed open the door to what had once been a witness waiting area, revealing a room that had been preserved almost exactly as it had been left when court operations had been relocated. Wooden benches lined the walls, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of nervous witnesses who had waited here before testifying in trials that had long since been concluded and forgotten. The walls were covered with framed portraits of judges who had served the court over the decades, stern-faced men and women whose photographs had been arranged chronologically to show the evolution of legal fashion and judicial temperament. Each portrait was accompanied by a small plaque that listed years of service and notable cases, creating a visual history of local jurisprudence that spanned nearly a century. Detective Park found herself studying these judicial portraits, trying to imagine the personalities and perspectives that had shaped legal proceedings in different eras. Some faces showed the austere formality that had once been expected of judges, while others revealed hints of compassion or humor that suggested more flexible approaches to the administration of justice. The room's windows had been covered with heavy curtains that filtered the basement's artificial lighting into a dim glow that seemed appropriate for the Contemplation of legal history. The atmosphere was hushed and reverent, as if the space still retained some echo of the solemnity that had once characterized courtroom proceedings, when justice had been administered with more ceremony and deliberation. She moved to what had been the court clerk's office, a space that had been organized with the meticulous attention to detail that had been necessary when legal records had been maintained entirely by hand. Wooden filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers labeled with case numbers and date ranges that covered decades of legal proceedings. Each cabinet represented thousands of hours of careful documentation, the patient work of clerks who had understood that their accuracy and thoroughness were essential to the proper functioning of the justice system. The filing system had been designed with redundancies and cross-references that ensured important documents could be located quickly, even without modern computer databases. Case files had been organized by date, by defendant name, by type of crime, and by presiding judge, creating multiple pathways to the same information that reflected the sophisticated organizational skills of court personnel who had managed complex legal proceedings without electronic assistance. Detective Park opened one of the filing cabinet drawers, revealing rows of manila folders that contained complete trial records from the 1960s. Each folder was labeled in the careful handwriting that had been standard before typewriters had become common in legal offices, penmanship that showed the pride and professionalism of clerks who had viewed their work as essential to the administration of justice. The trial records were comprehensive, including not just the basic legal documents, but also detailed notes about court proceedings, jury selection, and the various procedural issues that had arisen during trials. The thoroughness of the documentation reflected an era when court cases had proceeded more slowly and when clerks had been expected to maintain complete records that could support appeals or provide reference for similar future cases. She pulled a file at random, discovering the complete record of a murder trial from 1968 that had apparently attracted significant public attention based on the thickness of the folder and the number of newspaper clippings that had been included with the official court documents. The case had involved the death of a prominent businessman under circumstances that had raised questions about family relationships and financial motives. The trial transcript ran to several hundred pages, testimony that had been recorded by court stenographers whose skills had been essential to preserving accurate records of legal proceedings. Each witness's testimony had been captured word for word, creating a complete record that preserved not just the facts presented, but also the tone and style of examination and cross-examination that had characterized courtroom advocacy in that era. Detective Park read through portions of the testimony, finding herself drawn into the careful reconstruction of events that had led to the victim's death and the methodical presentation of evidence that had eventually convinced a jury to convict the defendant of murder. The legal arguments had been more formal and elaborate than contemporary trials, reflecting conventions and expectations that had valued eloquence and classical legal education. The jury selection process had been documented with particular care, showing how attorneys and judges had worked together to identify citizens who could fairly evaluate evidence and reach just verdicts. The questions asked of potential jurors revealed social attitudes and assumptions that were different from contemporary perspectives, providing insight into how community standards and legal expectations had evolved over the decades. The verdict had been guilty, and the sentencing had been recorded with the same attention to detail that characterized all aspects of the trial record. The judge's comments at sentencing had been preserved verbatim, revealing a judicial philosophy that emphasized deterrence and community protection. While acknowledging the human tragedy that had brought the case to court, she closed the murder trial file and explored other sections of the clerk's office, discovering areas that had been dedicated to different types of legal proceedings. Civil cases had been maintained separately from criminal cases, with their own filing systems and organizational schemes that reflected the different procedural requirements, and documentation standards that applied to different areas of law. The civil files revealed a different side of the court's historical work, documenting disputes over property, contracts, and personal relationships that had required legal resolution. These cases showed how the court system had served not just to punish criminal behavior, but also to resolve conflicts and enforce agreements that were essential to the functioning of a complex society. Detective Park found herself particularly interested in the divorce files, which provided insight into changing social attitudes about marriage and family relationships over the decades. The earlier files reflected legal and social conventions that had made divorce difficult and socially stigmatizing, while later files showed the gradual evolution toward more flexible and compassionate approaches to family dissolution. The custody arrangements documented in these files revealed how understanding of children's needs and interests had evolved over time, showing progression from arrangements that had been based primarily on traditional gender roles to more nuanced approaches that considered individual circumstances and the best interests of the children involved. She moved to another section of the basement that had once housed the probation department, discovering offices that had been equipped with the simple furniture and basic supplies that had been sufficient for social work and supervision activities. In an era when rehabilitation had been viewed as a realistic goal for most criminal offenders, the probation files contained detailed case histories that documented the backgrounds and circumstances of individuals who had been sentenced to supervised release rather than imprisonment. Each file revealed the careful assessment and monitoring work that had been required to help offenders reintegrate into society, while protecting public safety and ensuring compliance with court-ordered conditions. Detective Park read through several probation files, finding stories of individuals who had struggled with addiction, mental illness, unemployment, and family problems that had contributed to their criminal behavior. The probation officer's notes revealed patient work with clients who had faced multiple challenges while trying to rebuild their lives and avoid further contact with the justice system. The success stories documented in these files were encouraging, showing how intensive supervision and support had enabled many offenders to address the underlying problems that had led to their criminal behavior. The probation officers had served as counselors, advocates, and monitors, helping their clients navigate the complex process of rebuilding their lives while maintaining the trust and respect of the community. The failure cases were equally instructive, revealing the limitations of rehabilitation efforts and the complex factors that made successful reintegration difficult for some individuals. The probation officer's notes showed their frustration when clients had been unable or unwilling to take advantage of the opportunities provided, but also their persistence in trying different approaches and their commitment to giving every client multiple chances to succeed. Asterisk, as Detective Park continued her exploration of the basement courthouse, she began to appreciate how these forgotten spaces had once been the center of a comprehensive system for administering justice and maintaining social order. Each office and each filing system had been designed to support specific functions that had been essential to the proper operation of courts and the effective supervision of offenders. The physical spaces themselves reflected different assumptions about the pace and style of legal proceedings, designed for an era when cases had been processed more slowly and when personal relationships between court personnel, attorneys, and community members had been more important to the functioning of the justice system. She discovered what had been the court reporter's office, a space that had been organized around the specialized equipment and supplies that had been necessary for creating accurate transcripts of legal proceedings. The shorthand machines and carbon paper supplies that remained in the office provided tangible evidence of the skills and technology that had been essential to preserving accurate records before electronic recording had become standard. The court reporters had been crucial to the justice system, providing the accurate transcripts that had been necessary for appeals and for reference in related cases. Their work had required exceptional skill and concentration, and the quality of their transcripts had been essential to ensuring that legal proceedings could be reviewed and evaluated by appellate courts when necessary. The basement also contained what had been a law library, shelves lined with volumes of case law, statutes, and legal commentary that had provided attorneys and judges with the research resources they had needed to prepare for trials and make legal arguments. The book showed signs of heavy use, with margins full of notes and bookmarks that revealed how legal professionals had relied on these printed resources before computer databases had made legal research more efficient. Detective Park found herself fascinated by the marginalia in these old law books, handwritten notes that provided insight into how attorneys and judges had prepared for specific cases and had developed legal arguments. The notes revealed different approaches to legal research and different theories about how law should be interpreted and applied, showing the intellectual diversity that had characterized the legal profession in different eras. The law library also contained collections of local legal precedents and municipal codes that had governed the city's legal system over the decades. These volumes documented how local law had evolved in response to changing social conditions and community needs, showing the gradual development of legal frameworks that had been adapted to serve the specific circumstances of local government and community life. As the afternoon progressed, Detective Park found herself drawn deeper into the peaceful atmosphere of the basement courthouse, where the accumulated weight of decades of legal proceedings created a sense of continuity and purpose that connected past and present. Each room and each filing system represented the careful work of legal professionals who had dedicated their careers to serving justice and maintaining the rule of law. The forgotten basement spaces provided a unique perspective on how the justice system had evolved over time, showing how changes in technology, social attitudes, and legal theory had been reflected in the organization and operation of courts. The physical spaces themselves told stories about different approaches to legal proceedings and different assumptions about the proper role of courts in society. She discovered a room that had been used for jury deliberations, furnished with a large wooden table and chairs that had been designed to provide a comfortable and dignified setting for citizens to discuss evidence and reach verdicts. The room's isolation from other court activities had been intended to protect the integrity of jury deliberations and ensure that jurors could focus on their responsibilities without outside interference. The jury room contained portraits of founding fathers and other symbols of American democracy that had been intended to remind jurors of their important role in the justice system and their responsibility to uphold constitutional principles. The formal atmosphere of the room reflected the respect that had been shown for jury service and the recognition that citizen participation was essential to the legitimacy of the justice system. Detective Park found herself imagining the Kika discussions that had taken place in this room over the decades, the careful deliberations that had resulted in verdicts that had determined the fates of thousands of defendants. The jury system had been one of the most important innovations in the development of democratic institutions, providing a mechanism for community participation in the administration of justice that had helped ensure that legal proceedings reflected community standards and values. The basement courthouse represented more than just historical curiosity. It provided valuable perspective on how the justice system had functioned in different eras and how it might continue to evolve in response to changing social conditions and community needs. The careful preservation of these spaces and their contents had created a unique resource for understanding the history and development of American legal institutions. As Detective Park prepared to leave the basement courthouse, She reflected on the remarkable continuity that connected legal proceedings across different eras and different social conditions. The specific procedures and technologies had changed dramatically, but the fundamental commitment to fair proceedings and careful documentation had remained constant, creating an institutional memory that preserved the best traditions of American jurisprudence while allowing for adaptation and improvement. Over time, the quiet corridors and forgotten offices had provided a peaceful setting for contemplating the broader meaning and purpose of the justice system, reminding her of the important role that courts had played in maintaining social order and protecting individual rights throughout American history. The basement would continue its silent vigil, preserving the physical spaces and documentary records that testified to generations of dedicated service to the cause of justice and the rule of law. Asterisk. The residential streets that surrounded the courthouse had witnessed decades of change, their tree-lined sidewalks and modest homes serving as the backdrop for countless stories of crime and consequence that had never made headlines but had shaped the lives of families and individuals who had found themselves touched by the justice system in ways both large and small. Detective Angela Rodriguez had walked these neighborhoods many times during her 15-year career, called to homes where domestic disputes had escalated beyond family resolution, where burglaries had shattered residents' sense of security, where accidents and poor decisions had transformed ordinary citizens into victims or perpetrators of crimes that would follow them for years to come. The morning sunlight filtered through mature oak trees that had been planted when the neighborhood was new, casting dappled shadows on sidewalks that had been cracked and repaired countless times but still provided safe passage for children walking to school and elderly residents taking their daily exercise. Each block told its own story through the architectural styles and maintenance patterns that revealed how different families had cared for their homes over the generations. She paused at the corner of Maple and 3rd, remembering a case from 3 years ago when she had been called to investigate a burglary at the small blue house with white trim that sat behind a carefully maintained garden. The homeowner had been an elderly woman who had lived in the house for 40 years, raising 3 children and caring for an invalid husband before finding herself alone and increasingly vulnerable to criminals who targeted seniors living by themselves. The burglary had been discovered when a neighbor had noticed that Mrs. Patterson's front door had been standing open on a cold morning when she would normally have kept it closed and locked. The neighbor's concern had led to the discovery that someone had broken into the house during the night, taking jewelry and cash while Mrs. Patterson had slept undisturbed in her bedroom. Detective Rodriguez recalled how the investigation had revealed that the burglar had been someone Mrs. Patterson had trusted, a young man who had been hired to help with yard work and minor home repairs. He had used his access to the house to identify valuable items and to learn Mrs. Patterson's routines, knowledge that had enabled him to commit the burglary with minimal risk of detection or confrontation. Case had been solved quickly once neighbors had provided descriptions of the young man they had seen working around Mrs. Patterson's house, but the resolution had done little to restore her sense of security or trust in others. She had installed expensive security systems and had become increasingly isolated, afraid to hire help or to maintain the social connections that had made her life meaningful and fulfilling. Detective Rodriguez continued her walk through the neighborhood, noting how many houses now displayed security system decals and surveillance cameras that had not been necessary when the area had been built. The gradual increase in security measures told a story about changing social conditions and residents' perceptions of safety that reflected broader trends in urban and suburban crime. She turned onto Elm Street, where a small memorial garden marked the site where a traffic accident had claimed The life of a 7-year-old boy who had been riding his bicycle when struck by a drunk driver who had been speeding through the residential area. The garden had been created by neighbors who had wanted to ensure that Tommy Martinez would be remembered, and that his death would serve as a reminder of the need for traffic safety in areas where children played. The accident had occurred on a Saturday afternoon, when Tommy had been riding his new bike, a birthday present that had represented freedom and adventure to a child who had been learning to navigate his neighborhood with increasing independence. The drunk driver had been returning from a lengthy drinking session at a nearby bar, making the decision to drive despite obvious impairment and despite having other options for getting home safely. The investigation of Tommy's death had been straightforward, with multiple witnesses and clear evidence of the driver's intoxication and negligence. But the case had been complicated by the emotional impact on a community that had been forced to confront the reality that a child's life could be lost so suddenly and unnecessarily, that a moment of poor judgment could create permanent grief and loss for families who had done nothing wrong. Detective Rodriguez remembered attending Tommy's funeral, where hundreds of neighbors and community members had gathered to mourn a child they had watched grow up and to support a family that had been devastated by their loss. The service had been a reminder of how crime affected not just immediate victims but entire communities that had to process trauma and loss while trying to maintain faith in justice and social order. The drunk driver had been sentenced to prison, but his punishment had seemed inadequate compared to the permanent loss suffered by Tommy's family and the lasting impact on a neighborhood where children could no longer play with the carefree abandon that had once been taken for granted. The memorial garden had become a place where residents could remember Tommy while recommitting themselves to protecting other children from similar tragedies. As Detective Rodriguez continued her walk, she reflected on how many of her cases had involved ordinary people whose lives had been changed forever by encounters with crime, either as victims or as perpetrators, who had made decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time but had led to consequences they had never anticipated or intended. She passed a house where she had investigated a domestic violence case that had revealed the complex dynamics of abuse and control that could exist behind the facade of a normal suburban family. The house looked peaceful from the outside, with well-maintained landscaping and children's toys visible in the backyard. But Detective Rodriguez knew that appearances could be deceiving when it came to family, relationships, and private behaviors. The domestic violence case had been reported by a teacher who had noticed bruises on a 10-year-old girl and had suspected that abuse was occurring at home. The investigation had revealed a pattern of violence that had been carefully hidden from neighbors and extended family. Violence that had escalated over time as the abuser had become more confident that his behavior would not be detected or challenged. The mother had initially been reluctant to cooperate with the investigation, afraid of losing her children and her home if her husband was arrested and prosecuted. Her reluctance had been complicated by financial dependence and social isolation that had made it difficult for her to imagine how she could survive without her abuser's support, even though his presence had made her life dangerous and unpredictable. Detective Rodriguez had worked patiently with victim advocates and social service agencies to help the mother understand that protection and support were available, that leaving an abusive relationship was possible with appropriate assistance and planning. The process had taken months, but eventually the mother had found the courage to testify against her husband and to accept the help she needed to rebuild her life with her children. The case had resulted in the abuser's conviction and a restraining order that had protected the family from further violence. But the recovery process had been long and difficult. The children had required counseling to help them process the trauma they had witnessed, and the mother had needed extensive support to develop the skills and confidence necessary for independent living. The house now belonged to a different family, and Detective Rodriguez found herself hoping that the new residents were finding the peace and security that had been denied to the previous occupants. The neighborhood had rallied around the mother and children during their transition, providing practical assistance and emotional support that had helped them begin new lives free from violence and fear. She continued down the street to a corner house where she had investigated a case of elder abuse that had been perpetrated by the victim's own son, someone who had been trusted to help manage his mother's affairs, but who had instead exploited her vulnerability for his own financial benefit. The case had been discovered when bank personnel had become suspicious about large withdrawals from the elderly woman's account and had contacted authorities about possible exploitation. The investigation had revealed systematic financial abuse that had been ongoing for years, with the son gradually draining his mother's savings while isolating her from other family members who might have questioned his management of her finances. He had convinced her that other relatives were trying to steal from her, creating paranoia and distrust that had made her dependent on him for information about the outside world. The elder abuse case had been particularly troubling because it had involved the betrayal of family trust and the exploitation of someone who had become increasingly vulnerable due to age and declining health. The son had taken advantage of his mother's love and trust to commit crimes that had not only stolen her money but had also isolated her from relationships and activities that had given her life meaning and pleasure. Detective Rodriguez remembered how difficult it had been to gain the elderly woman's cooperation with the investigation, since she had been conditioned to distrust law enforcement and to believe that any intervention would result in her being placed in a nursing home where she would be neglected and forgotten. Breaking through this conditioning had required patience and cultural sensitivity, working with social workers who had specialized training in elder abuse cases. The resolution had included the son's prosecution for financial elder abuse and the implementation of protective services that had ensured the elderly woman could receive appropriate care while maintaining as much independence as possible. She had been relocated to an assisted living facility where she could receive medical attention and social interaction while being protected from further exploitation. The house had remained empty for months after the elderly woman's relocation, standing as a reminder of how family relationships could be corrupted by greed and how vulnerable adults needed protection from those who would exploit their trust and dependency. Eventually, the house had been sold to pay for the woman's care, providing at least partial justice for the financial losses she had suffered. As Detective Rodriguez walked through these quiet residential streets, she began to see how each house and each family represented potential intersections with the criminal justice system, places where human weakness, poor judgment, desperation, or malice could create situations that required police intervention and legal resolution. The neighborhood's apparent tranquility masked the reality that crime and victimization could occur anywhere, that the social problems documented in police reports and court files were not limited to obviously troubled areas, but could emerge in any community where people lived and worked and raised families. She passed a small apartment building where she had investigated a series of burglaries that had been committed by someone who had been familiar with the building's layout and security weaknesses. The perpetrator had turned out to be a former maintenance worker who had retained keys and had used his knowledge of resident schedules to commit crimes over a period of several months. The burglary investigation had revealed how trust and access could be exploited by individuals who were willing to betray the confidence that had been placed in them. The maintenance worker had been hired based on recommendations and had performed his job responsibilities competently. But he had also been struggling with drug addiction that had gradually led him to rationalize criminal behavior as necessary to support his habit. The case had been solved when residents had finally recognized a pattern in the Kovu burglaries and had contacted police about their suspicions regarding the former maintenance worker. His arrest had led to the recovery of some stolen property and had ended a crime spree that had made residents feel unsafe in their own homes. The apartment building had improved its security procedures as a result of the burglaries, implementing better background checks and key control measures that would make similar crimes more difficult in the future. But residents had also learned that security required constant vigilance and that trust could be misplaced even when people seemed reliable and trustworthy. Detective Rodriguez reflected on how many of her cases had involved people who had seemed normal and trustworthy, but who had been struggling with problems that had eventually led them to make destructive decisions. Addiction, mental illness, financial desperation, and relationship conflicts could affect anyone, creating situations where previously law-abiding citizens could find themselves involved in criminal behavior that they would never have imagined possible. The residential neighborhoods where these crimes had occurred provided a constant reminder that the boundary between law-abiding citizens and criminal offenders was often thinner than people wanted to believe. Most people were capable of making poor decisions under sufficient stress or temptation, and most communities included individuals who were struggling with problems that could potentially lead to criminal behavior. As she completed her walk through the neighborhood, Detective Rodriguez found herself appreciating the complexity of police work in residential areas where officers were called upon to intervene in situations that often involved people who were neighbors, friends, or family members rather than strangers. The personal relationships and community connections that characterized these areas made police work more challenging but also more meaningful, since successful intervention could preserve relationships and prevent the kind of escalation that might otherwise destroy families and communities. The quiet streets and well-maintained homes represented the best of American community life, places where people worked to create safe and nurturing environments for their families, while contributing to the broader social fabric that made civilization possible. But they also represented the ongoing challenge of maintaining that safety and social order in the face of human weakness and the various pressures that could lead otherwise decent people to make destructive choices. Detective Rodriguez returned to her car with renewed appreciation for the complexity of her work and for the importance of approaching each case with understanding and compassion for all involved parties. The neighborhoods she served were not just geographic areas but communities of real people whose lives could be dramatically affected by how police officers chose to exercise their authority and discretion. The residential streets would continue to present new challenges and new opportunities for positive intervention, requiring officers who understood that their work involved not just enforcing laws but also helping people navigate difficult circumstances and find constructive solutions to problems that might otherwise lead to criminal behavior. The peaceful atmosphere of well-tended neighborhoods could be deceptive, but it also represented the goal toward which all police work was directed. Communities where people could live safely and pursue their dreams without fear of victimization or unnecessary contact with the criminal justice system.